There are cases in my long record of association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes which resist, even now, the comfortable categories of memory. Most of what I have set down over the years arranges itself naturally enough into a kind of order, the client, the crime, the investigation, the resolution, a shape as satisfying and as familiar as a well-made sentence. But there are others, fewer in number and different in character, which refuse that tidiness. They leave behind them not the clean satisfaction of a solved equation, but something murkier, more human, the residue of lives that were broken and imperfectly mended, of truths that turned out to be the wrong shape for the boxes built to hold them. The affair of the broken compass is one of those cases. I have delayed setting it down for longer than I care to admit, partly from an instinct that some of its particulars touch upon matters which are not entirely mine to publish, and partly because I have never been quite certain that I understood it completely even now, even after Holmes laid it all out for us in that lamplit room on the final evening, with the fog pressing against the windows and the fire burning low. Understanding, I have come to think, is not always the same thing as comprehension. One can follow every step of a man's reasoning and still not feel, in the deep and wordless way that matters, that one has truly grasped what was at stake. But I set it down now. At Holmes's prompting he has his reasons, which he declines to share, as is his invariable custom, and I shall set it down as honestly as I can, which is to say, as Watson saw it, which is to say, imperfectly, and with full acknowledgment of that imperfection. It began on a Wednesday in early February, in the 3rd year after Holmes's return from that long and terrible absence which I shall not dwell upon here. London was in the grip of a cold that had descended from the north with the purposeful malice of an invader, freezing the puddles in the gutters, turning the fog to something almost solid, driving the city's poor into whatever shelter they could find, and the city's prosperous into their clubs and dining rooms, where the fires burned high and the curtains were drawn against the dark. I had spent the afternoon at my practice, which in those years was a modest but tolerable affair in Kensington, and arrived at Baker Street in the early evening to find Holmes in one of his more animated states, which is to say, not the dark and concentrated stillness of a man in the depths of a problem, but the restless, barely contained energy of a man between problems. He was pacing. He does not pace when thinking. He sits, or stands, or lies with extraordinary stillness. He paces when he has nothing to think about, and the pacing, if one is in the room long enough to observe it, is subtly different from ordinary movement, faster, more angular, with sudden stops and reversals that suggest a man repeatedly reaching the wall of a too small room. "Watson," he said, without looking up from the floor, "you have been to see Mrs. Partridge." I had been to see Mrs. Partridge. She was a patient of 60 years with a chronic chest condition and a remarkable unwillingness to follow any medical advice I offered. I had not mentioned her to Holmes. I set my bag down and regarded him with the particular wariness that his unannounced deductions always inspired, not surprise, exactly, for I had long since ceased to be surprised, but a kind of alertness, the feeling of a man who has learned that magicians are working, and has resolved to watch more carefully this time. "How," I said, "do you arrive at Mrs. Partridge?" Holmes stopped pacing and looked at me properly for the first time since I'd entered. His grey eyes moved over me with that rapid, dissecting attention, 2 seconds at most, covering every inch, and then the faint, sardonic quality that passed for a smile in his repertoire crossed his features. "Your coat," he said, "has a fine dusting of coal ash on the left sleeve, beginning at the elbow, consistent with leaning against a mantelpiece while your patient sits in the chair nearest the fire. That tells me the patient is elderly, because the young do not monopolize the warmth, and female, because the arrangement of your chair relative to the mantelpiece visible in the angle of the ash deposit places you in the subordinate position of the consulting physician, rather than the position of authority you would naturally assume with a male patient of the same age. The coal ash itself is of the cheaper compressed sort, block coal, sold by the hundredweight in the poorer streets, but also used, for reasons of economy, by the elderly on fixed incomes who maintain addresses in the better districts. Your own practice is in Kensington, where the better districts are adjacent to the meaner ones, and where an elderly woman of modest means but genteel habit might very naturally reside. Finally he paused for effect. I always suspected. You have a smear of camphor oil on your right cuff, which you use in precisely one combination of patient and complaint. The thoracic liniment you prescribed for Mrs. Partridge in November. the preparation of which I observed you writing up in some detail, and with an expression of significant therapeutic optimism. I looked at my cuffs. The camphor oil was there, faint but present. "I was not aware," I said, "that you had taken any notice of Mrs. Partridge's prescription." "I take notice of everything," Holmes said, with no particular satisfaction in it. "The difficulty is that at present there is nothing worthy of notice, and the faculty grows restless in the absence of material." He resumed his pacing. 3 days, Watson. 3 days without a single case of any substance. Lestrade sent round a forgery this morning that a reasonably attentive bank clerk could have resolved without assistance. I sent it back." "You sent it back?" "With a note. The forger is a left-handed lithographer currently residing in rooms above a print shop in Aldgate. Lestrade will find him without difficulty, and will experience the customary mixture of satisfaction and resentment." He waved a hand. "The point is that the mind requires exercise of a particular kind, Watson, as the body requires a particular diet, and 3 days of Lestrade's counterfeiting cases and society poisonings is the intellectual equivalent of living on bread and water. He might have continued in this vein he was, when the intervals grew long, quite capable of sustaining a philosophical lament about the inadequacy of London's criminal classes, for considerable periods, but at that moment we both heard it. The door below opened hastily, and then Miss Hudson's voice, and then a second voice, lower and rougher and with an urgency in it that carried even through the floor and ceiling. Holmes stopped pacing. He turned toward the door with that absolute sudden stillness like a compass needle swinging to north. The man who was presently shown up to our sitting-room was not what I had expected from the urgency of his voice. He was perhaps 50 years of age, powerfully built, but with the beginning of that dissolution about the frame which follows hard physical labor that has been abruptly curtailed. His hands were the hands of a working man, large, scarred, with permanent darkness in the creases that no amount of washing would remove, but his coat, though old, was of good cloth, and his boots, though wet from the street, had been recently and carefully polished. A man, I thought, who had once had standards and was working hard, under difficult circumstances, to maintain them. His face was a different matter. It was the face of a man in the grip of something beyond ordinary distress, not the sharp, coherent agitation of anger, nor the soft collapse of grief, but something wilder and more disoriented, as if the ground under his feet had moved without warning and he had not yet regained his balance. "Mr. Holmes," he said. His voice was steady, which cost him something I could see it cost him. "My name is Arthur Crewe. I was a navigator. 22 years in the merchant marine, sir, and before that the navy. I have sailed to places that don't appear on English maps, and I have not in 51 years asked another man for help with anything I could not settle myself." He stopped. He put his large, scarred hands on the back of the chair nearest him and gripped it. "My son is dead. The police say it was an accident. I know, Mr. Holmes. The way a navigator knows a false bearing, I know that it was not." Holmes said nothing. He stood very still, watching the man with that quality of total, undemonstrative attention. "They found him in the river," Crewe continued. "Pulled out below Blackfriars Bridge at 6 o'clock this morning. They say he fell. James was 24 years old, Mr. Holmes, and he had his sea legs at 14. He did not fall into rivers." Something shifted in the man's face, not breaking exactly, but the effort of holding it became for a moment visible. In his coat pocket they found this. He reached into his own coat and produced, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has decided that this object is important, and has handled it accordingly since making that decision, a compass. He set it on Holmes's table. It was a navigator's compass, a good one, or had been. The brass casing was old but well maintained, the kind of instrument that had been cleaned and cared for over many years. The glass face was intact, but the needle inside was broken, snapped cleanly at the pivot, so that both halves lay in the bottom of the casing at identical angles, pointing nowhere at all. "That compass," said Arthur Crewe, "belonged to me. I gave it to James when he made his first crossing 7 years ago. He never went to sea without it." He looked at Holmes with eyes that had the particular quality of a man who has been holding something back for many hours and has come, at last, to the place where he may put it down. "It was not broken when I gave it to him, and James would no more have broken that compass than he would have broken his own hand. It was the most careful boy with an instrument you ever saw. When did you last see your son?" Holmes asked. His voice was quiet and perfectly level. Sunday evening. He came for supper. He was agitated. Not in himself, you understand. Not ill or distressed, but there was something on his mind. I asked him about it, and he said— Crewe paused, and I saw the memory of the moment cross his face like weather. He said, "Father, there are things I've seen that I don't yet know how to speak about." And then he ate his supper and kissed his mother's cheek and went out into the dark. The fire crackled in the grate. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass with patient yellowish persistence. Holmes stood looking at the broken compass on the table with that inward, listening expression that I had by then learned to recognize not as the beginning of thought, but as the moment when thought, having done its preliminary work in private, begins to acquire direction. "Dr. Watson," he said at last, without looking away from the compass, "I believe you should fetch your coat." He picked up the compass very carefully between his long fingers and turned it slowly in the lamplight, watching the broken needle halves shift against the casing. Something in his expression, something I could not name, and would not have named correctly if I had tried, told me that whatever question had formed itself in his mind in that moment, it was not a simple one, and it was not yet one he intended to share. "Mr. Crewe," he said, setting the compass down again, "I should like to know everything your son said to you on Sunday evening. Every word precisely as you remember it. We shall begin there." And so we did, and the compass sat between us on the table, its broken needle pointing at nothing, while outside the city breathed its cold and foggy breath, and somewhere beneath Blackfriars Bridge the Black River moved on, carrying its secrets south toward the sea. There is a particular quality to the silence that falls in our Baker Street sitting-room when Holmes has decided to listen. It is not the silence of a man waiting for his turn to speak, nor the polite, half-attentive quiet of social courtesy. It is something altogether more deliberate, a silence with weight and purpose, the silence of a trap set with exquisite care, into which words fall and are held and examined with a precision that the speaker rarely suspects and would likely find unsettling if they did. I have sat opposite that silence 100 times on my own side of the fireplace, and even I, who know its nature better than any man alive, find it subtly unnerving. It demands honesty the way a very steady gaze demands it, not by asking, but simply by being. Arthur Crewe, to his credit, met it well. He was, as I have said, a man of the sea and of long habit, and men who have spent 22 years reading weather and water learn something about patience that those of us confined to drawing-rooms and consulting-rooms rarely acquire. He sat in the basket chair with his large hands resting on his knees, and he spoke, and Holmes listened, and the fire burned, and the fog outside pressed its yellow face against the glass. What Crewe told us over the course of the next 40 minutes, I shall attempt to render here with the same fidelity with which I recorded it in my notebook that evening, adding only such clarifications as the passage of time and the subsequent events of the case make necessary for the reader's understanding. James Arthur Crewe had been, by his father's account, an exceptional young man in the particular way that is most difficult to summarize and most easily dismissed. He was good. Not clever in the showy sense, though he was clever enough, having taken a first-rate certificate at the Maritime Board examinations at the age of 22, and not ambitious in the consuming way that makes men interesting to observe from a distance and difficult to know at close quarters. He was careful, thorough, honest to a degree that his father described with a mixture of pride and the faint, rueful acknowledgment of a man who knows that honesty, taken neat, can be an inconvenient quality in this world. He had his father's love of the sea and his mother's temperament steady, warm, slow to alarm. He had been employed for the past 14 months as a junior navigational officer aboard the Hesperine, a steam-assisted cargo vessel of moderate tonnage registered out of London and engaged primarily in the coastal trade between the Thames estuary, the Channel ports, and occasionally the nearer reaches of the North Sea. It was unglamorous work, Crewe said, and not what James had imagined when he took his certificate, but it was honest work with a solid company, and it kept him on the water, which was what mattered. The Hesperine, Holmes said, without any particular inflection. It was not a question and not quite a statement. He had not moved from his position by the mantelpiece since Crewe had begun his account, and I noticed, as I had noticed before in similar circumstances, that he had at some point produced his old clay pipe and was holding it, unlit, as an aid to thought. "Owned by the Callaway Shipping Company," Crewe said. "Operating out of the Pool of London. "A respectable firm. As far as I know, I made inquiries when James took the position naturally." "Naturally," Holmes agreed. "Go on." "The Hesperine had returned to London 4 days ago on the Saturday, completing a run from Hamburg that had taken 9 days longer than scheduled, a delay attributed, in the company's communication to the owners of the cargo, to adverse weather in the North Sea. James had come ashore on Saturday evening and presented himself at his parents' home in Stepney, the same house in which he had grown up, on Sunday, as his habit was when in port. He was different, Crewe said. I noticed it the moment he came through the door. James's was he stopped briefly, and the correction cost him a settled sort of young man, easy in himself. But on Sunday he was restless. He ate, but I don't think he tasted anything. He kept going to the window. Which window? Holmes asked. And which direction did he look? Crewe paused. The specificity of the question clearly surprised him, as Holmes's specific questions invariably surprise people who have not yet understood that he does not ask questions without reason. The front parlor window, he said slowly, looking toward the street, as if he expected someone or feared someone. I couldn't say which. He looked at his hands. I asked him twice what was troubling him. The first time he said it was nothing, which I knew was not true. The second time was when he said what I told you about things he'd seen that he didn't know how to speak of yet. A pause. I should have pressed him. I have thought of little else since yesterday morning. You could not have known, Holmes said, not with the soothing automatism of condolence, but with the flat, factual certainty of a man who has considered the question and arrived at a conclusion. Did he say anything else? Anything at all that seemed out of the ordinary, a name, a place, a reference you did not understand? Crewe was quiet for a moment. His eyes had the unfocused quality of a man searching memory, running his hands along its shelves in the dark. Then he asked me about the law. Holmes's attention, already considerable, sharpened perceptibly. In what sense? He asked me, and I remember this precisely because it struck me as peculiar. Coming from James, he asked me whether a man could be prosecuted for knowing about a crime and not reporting it, whether silence made a man guilty. Crewe looked up from his hands. I told him I didn't know. I'm a navigator, not a lawyer. He nodded, as if that was the answer he expected, and then we talked of other things. The fire settled in the grate with a soft collapsing sound. Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then, you said you gave it to him when he made his first crossing. Do you recall which crossing? The meridian out of Liverpool, Crewe said immediately. Hamburg Run, 7 years ago, October. James was 17. There was something in his voice when he said it, not grief exactly, not yet, but the particular ache of a memory that has become painful by association, like a clean room in a house that is burned. And you said it was not broken when last you saw it in his possession. When was that? Christmas. He showed it to me. We were talking about his father's days on the Navy vessels, and he produced it from his coat to show his younger sister. It was whole then. I examined it myself in the way you do with something you made a gift of checking that it was still well, still being cared for. He paused. It was perfect. Still well, still being cared for. He paused. It was perfect. The needle was true. Holmes crossed to the table and picked up the compass again. He carried it to the lamp and held it so that the light fell directly through the glass face, illuminating the broken halves of the needle where they lay in the bottom of the casing. I watched him turn it slowly, and I watched his face, which gave away rather less than most faces do under examination, but which gave away, to someone who had studied it as long as I had, a certain precise quality of concentrated interest. The look, I always thought, of a man reading a text in a language he knows well, but which contains a passage of unusual construction. The break, he said, more to himself than to us. Watson, come and look at this. I went and looked. The needle was of hardened steel standard for a navigator's compass of that quality, and it had been broken, as I have said, at the pivot. Both halves lay in the casing at angles of approximately 45 degrees from the break point. What do you make of the break itself? Holmes asked me. I looked more closely. The fractured ends of the needle were visible under the glass, and even without a lens I could see something that I might, examining it alone, have thought unremarkable, but which, in Holmes's company and with his question directing my attention, struck me as worth noting. The break is clean, I said. Very clean. Not the irregular fracture you'd expect from a fall or an impact. No, Holmes agreed. It is not. A needle broken by accident by the compass being dropped or struck would show a ragged, irregular fracture, with microstriations running in multiple directions from the point of stress. This break is almost perfectly planar. It was broken deliberately, Watson, with a tool of some kind, pliers, or a small vise, and broken with care. He set the compass down. Someone took some trouble over this. But why? I said. If the intention was simply to destroy the compass. The intention was not to destroy it, Holmes said. If the intention had been destruction, the compass would not have been returned to the dead man's pocket. The intention was to send a message. He turned to Crewe, who had been listening to this exchange with an expression of pained, focused attention. Mr. Crewe, did your son have any particular associates aboard the Hesperine whom you knew of? Friends or men he spoke of with any regularity? Crewe considered. There was a man called Pardue, the first mate. James mentioned him several times. Not warmly, I thought, but with a kind of respect, I suppose. The way you respect a man you're not certain you trust. And there was another fellow, a deckhand, who James had known from a previous berth. Hannigan, I think. And the captain? A man named Alborn. Captain Robert Alborn. James never spoke of him much, which I took to mean he was neither very good nor very bad. Just the captain. Holmes nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is filing something away rather than responding to it. He moved back to the fireplace and stood with one arm along the mantelpiece, staring at the middle distance with those clear, cold eyes. I knew that look. It was the look of a man assembling a preliminary framework, not building yet, not quite, but laying out the materials, checking their quality, considering the weight-bearing joints. "Where is the Hesperine now?" he asked. "Still in the pool, as far as I know. She's not scheduled to sail again until the end of the week if the company keeps its normal pattern." Holmes straightened from the mantelpiece with sudden decision. "Mr. Crewe, I shall take your case. I make no promises. I never make promises on the strength of what I do not yet know, but I will tell you this much. Your instinct is correct. This is not a simple accident, and the compass is not a simple object. Someone has gone to some considerable trouble to make this look like a straightforward tragedy, and the very thoroughness of that effort tells me something important." "What does it tell you?" Crewe asked. "That whoever arranged this was afraid of your son," Holmes said simply. "Not angry. Not reckless. A frightened man is a more dangerous thing than an angry one because he is also a careful one." He looked at Crewe steadily. "I will need you to be patient, and I will need you to be silent about the fact that you have come to me. Can you do both of those things?" "I have been patient and silent for 22 years at sea," Crewe said. "I think I can manage a few more days." The ghost of something not quite a smile crossed Holmes's features. After Crewe had gone, pressing Holmes's hand with the wordless fervency of a man who does not trust himself to say what he wishes to say, and descending the stairs and out into the cold and fog below, Holmes and I remained for some time in the sitting-room without speaking. He had resumed his position by the mantelpiece, the unlit pipe still in his hand, and he was looking at the broken compass on the table with an expression that I found, try as I might, impossible to read. "Well," I said, when the silence had stretched long enough to require some acknowledgment of it, "what do you make of it?" "I make of it," Holmes said slowly, "a case of considerable interest and not inconsiderable danger." He paused. "The weather delay on the Hamburg run. 9 days beyond schedule, attributed to North Sea conditions. You doubt it? I shall check the meteorological records for the North Sea in the relevant period tomorrow morning. I have some acquaintance with the subject." He turned from the compass at last and looked at me. "Watson, what do you know of the coastal trade between here and Hamburg?" "Very little," I admitted. "Then let me tell you something that may become relevant. The coastal trade between the Thames and the continent is largely unexamined. The revenue cutters attend to it in theory, but in practice the volume of traffic is too great and the resources too limited for any thoroughness. A vessel of moderate tonnage, if her papers were in order and her captain reliable, could make stops that did not appear in her official log and carry cargo that did not appear in her manifest, and do so with a very reasonable expectation of never being discovered." He picked up the compass one final time and looked at it. "A young man of honesty and conscience, finding himself aboard such a vessel, would face a very particular dilemma." I looked at him. "Such a vessel would face a very particular dilemma." I looked at him. "You think James Crewe discovered something illegal aboard the Hesperine? I think James Crewe discovered something that frightened someone badly enough to kill him for it, and to break his compass as a warning or a symbol or both." Holmes set the compass down very carefully, as if it were a sleeping thing. "The question is what?" And the question after that is to whom the warning was addressed. He turned to the fire and stood looking into it, and I saw, in the set of his shoulders and the angle of his head, that familiar quality of contained urgency, the engine, which had been starved for 3 days, now properly fueled and running at speed. "Tomorrow," he said, "we go to the river." The Thames in February is not the river that the painters choose. There are no golden afternoons on its surface, no pleasure craft trailing white wakes through blue water, no clement light catching the dome of St. Paul's in the becoming way that appears on the prints sold outside the National Gallery. In February the river is a working thing, grey and purposeful and cold, carrying its traffic of coal barges and steam-lighters and laden merchantmen with the indifferent efficiency of a man who has too much to do to be concerned with appearances. The smell of it reaches you before you see it. Mud and salt and coal smoke and something older beneath those, the mineral exhalation of a waterway that has been receiving the city's commerce and the city's waste for 2,000 years, and has grown, one imagines, philosophical about both. Holmes and I arrived at the Pool of London at 8:30 the following morning, having breakfasted early and taken a cab to the waterfront at Fresh Wharf, where the vessels of the coastal trade were moored in their customary congestion, a press of hulls and rigging and funnel smoke that resolved itself, as one drew closer, into individual ships, each with its own character and history and smell. The wharf side was alive already with the business of the day. Stevedores moving in the disciplined, unhurried way of men who have made a science of heavy labor, clerks with manifests and ledgers picking their fastidious way between coils of rope and stacked crates, the occasional supervisor in a better coat than the workers, standing with the proprietary confidence of a man whose job is to watch other men work and ensure they do it adequately. Holmes had dressed that morning with a deliberateness that I recognized as purposeful. He had left the Baker Street rooms in a coat that was good but not conspicuous, a scarf of plain wool, and a cap of the kind worn by the better class of commercial traveller, a man of business, the clothing said, familiar with the waterfront but not native to it. He had also, I noticed, adopted very slightly a different quality of movement, less precise, less angular, the habitual unconscious economy of his gestures softened into something more ordinarily human. It was not a disguise exactly, he had made no alteration to his features, and no extravagance of costume, but it was a performance of a kind, subtle and practised, and it reminded me, as such moments always did, that Holmes's understanding of human observation was not merely theoretical. "The Hesperine," he said, consulting a slip of paper on which he had noted the vessel's berth number, obtained the previous evening through channels he had not specified, "is at the 4th berth on the south side of the commercial dock. This way, she was a vessel of perhaps 800 tons, a steam-assisted coastal trader of the type common on the North Sea and Channel routes, with a single funnel amidships, a cargo hold fore and aft, and the slightly weathered, business-like appearance of a ship that is used hard and maintained adequately, but not lovingly. She rode at her mooring with the easy confidence of a vessel that has weathered enough to be comfortable in her own hull. The name Hesperine was painted on her bow in white letters that had begun to yellow at the edges. There were men working on the foredeck, and a gangway was down. Holmes walked up it without hesitation, and I followed, and we were aboard before anyone had thought to stop us. A mate, not, I thought, the first mate, but a younger man of perhaps 30 intercepted us at the head of the gangway with the automatic suspicion of a man whose ship has recently been visited by the police. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "I hope so," Holmes said, producing a card from his coat pocket, not his own card, I noticed, but one that identified him as Mr. Sheridan, representing the offices of Whitmore and Crane, marine insurance adjusters. I had not known he possessed such a card, and I did not ask. "We are making preliminary inquiries in connection with the recent incident. A formality, you understand, but the underwriters are naturally anxious to satisfy themselves that there is no question of liability attaching to the vessel or her officers." The mate received this with a slightly dazed compliance that the invocation of insurance tends to produce in people who are not certain what their relationship to it is. "You'd want Mr. Pardue, then?" "First mate, he's below." "Capital," Holmes said. "We shall wait on deck, if you don't mind. A fine vessel, I should like to look her over while we wait. Professional habit." The mate, apparently satisfied that we were the sort of people who had professional habits and were entitled to indulge them, went below. Holmes immediately moved to the rail and looked down at the waterline, then forward along the hull with the focused attention of a man reading a text. "What are you looking for?" I murmured. "Signs of recent modification," he said, his voice low and unhurried. "A vessel used for unlocked stops for the transfer of goods that do not appear in the manifest will often show small physical evidence of that use, if one knows where to look. Modified cargo handling equipment, additional mooring points in unconventional positions, wear patterns on the hull or deck that are inconsistent with the vessel's stated route and schedule." He straightened. "There you see the starboard rail at the point where the cargo hold begins. The paint is fresh, a section approximately 4 feet long, recently redone. And the mooring cleat below it newer hardware than the rest, and the bolts are not yet oxidized." I looked. He was right, the paint was visibly fresher in that section, lighter in shade than the surrounding surface. "It might simply be maintenance," I said. "It might, and the additional mooring ring bolted to the hull just below the waterline, where you can see it from this angle, might also be maintenance. Though I confess I have not frequently encountered a maintenance protocol that adds mooring hardware to the hull of a vessel 3 feet below the deck rail." He moved away from the side with casual ease as footsteps sounded on the companionway ladder. Mr. Pardue, the first mate of the Hesperine, was a man who repaid careful observation. He was perhaps 45, of medium height and solid, economical build, the build of a man who has spent his life in physical work and has arrived at a kind of dense, efficient compactness, nothing wasted, nothing excessive. His face was weathered to a deep and even brown, the kind of color that does not fade between voyages, and his eyes were of a pale, clear gray that was almost colorless in the February light. They were quick eyes, very quick, and they moved over Holmes and myself with a speed and thoroughness that suggested the assessment was complete before he had fully emerged from the companionway. "Gentlemen," he said. His voice was steady, unhurried, and told nothing. "I understand you are from the insurance company." "That is correct," Holmes said. "Mr. and my colleague Dr. Whitmore," I maintained with some effort a neutral expression at this baptism, "we are sorry to trouble you at what must be a difficult time. The death of a junior officer is always a distressing thing." "It is," Pardue said. He said it flatly, without the performance of distress, which might have been either the stoicism of a working sailor or the composure of a man who has already decided what to feel about James Crewe's death and has arranged that feeling to his satisfaction. "Our concern," Holmes continued, "is primarily with the circumstances of the accident. The underwriters are anxious to establish that the vessel's safety protocols were not deficient in any way. A matter of record purely—" "The police have already been over all that," Pardue said. "Indeed, and we have spoken with the police. There is, however, one matter which they touched upon only briefly, and which is of particular interest to our principals." Holmes paused with the deliberate, unhurried rhythm of a man who has all day and knows it. "The delay on the Hamburg run. 9 days beyond the scheduled return." Something moved in Pardue's pale eyes. It was very quicker, perhaps, than he intended, and it was not quite what I would have called fear. It was more like the look of a chess player who has seen an unexpected move on the board and is rapidly calculating its implications. "Weather," he said. "North Sea in January is what it is." "Quite so. And yet the meteorological records for the relevant period." Holmes produced a folded paper from his coat pocket, which he opened and consulted with the unhurried competence of a man who is entirely comfortable with meteorological records, "suggest that conditions in the North Sea between the 17th and the 23rd of January were, while cold, not especially severe. Force 4 to 5, with a brief period of 6 on the 20th. Not comfortable, but well within the operating parameters of a vessel of the Hesperine's specification." Pardue looked at the paper Holmes held. His expression did not change precisely, but something in the quality of his stillness altered, became a fraction more deliberate. "There were Mechanical. A problem with the auxiliary engine that took time to resolve. Was that logged?" "The captain maintains the log." "Of course." "We shall need to speak with Captain Alborn." "The captain," Pardue said, "is not aboard at present. When do you expect him?" I couldn't say, and then, with a precision that I thought was not accidental, "He has been unwell since our return." Holmes folded the meteorological paper and returned it to his coat pocket with a nod of mild acceptance that gave nothing away. "I see." "Then perhaps we might speak with some of the other crew. A routine matter, interviewing the officers, a selection of the crew. Standard procedure for the underwriters in cases of this kind. "I would prefer," Pardoux said, "that any further interviews were conducted through the company's own solicitors. That is the Callaway Shipping Company's standard policy in matters of this kind." The last phrase, "matters of this kind," was delivered with a faint but unmistakable emphasis, as if he wished to remind us that the nature of this particular matter had been established and need not be re-examined. Holmes received this with every appearance of equanimity. "Entirely reasonable. We shall contact the company directly. Thank you for your time, Mr. Pardoux." We left the Hesperine by the gangway and walked back along the wharf without speaking until we had put sufficient distance between ourselves and the vessel to make conversation private. Then Holmes said, quietly and without preamble, "His left hand. I beg your pardon?" "Pardoux's left hand." When I produced the meteorological paper, he reached for it involuntarily, a reflex, the instinct of a man accustomed to handling documents and assessing their content quickly. He stopped himself, but the reach was there, and the hand in that unguarded half-second showed two things: a callus on the inner side of the third finger consistent with the regular use of a pen or pencil, not unusual for a first mate, and a fresh abrasion on the knuckle of the index finger, approximately 3 days old, of the kind produced when the hand strikes a hard, flat surface. I considered this a blow of some kind, or a foe, but the location of the abrasion, the knuckle rather than the palm, suggests the former. A man who falls forward instinctively turns his palms out. A man who strikes something in anger or urgency strikes with the knuckle. Holmes paused. 3 days ago is Monday. James Crewe was found in the river on Wednesday morning. The medical examiner placed the time of death between 10 o'clock Sunday night and 2 o'clock Monday morning. The implication was plain enough. I let it settle before speaking. "You think Pardoux was involved directly?" "I think Pardoux is a man of considerable composure who was nonetheless caught off guard by the meteorological records. That composure is professional, the composure of a man who has spent years at sea, where self-command is a practical requirement rather than a social grace. For such a man to be visibly disconcerted by a piece of paper is informative." He stopped walking and turned to look back at the Hesperine, where Pardoux had already disappeared from the deck. "But he is not the architect of this, Watson. He is too careful to be operating independently and too uncomfortable to be the man in control." "Then who is?" "That," Holmes said, "is the question that Captain Aldbourne's convenient illness may be designed to prevent us from asking him." He turned away from the river. "I should like to know considerably more about the Callaway Shipping Company, and I should like, if possible, to know what cargo the Hesperine was carrying on the Hamburg run, both what her manifest states and what she was actually carrying." He began to walk. "There is also the matter of the deckhand, Hannigan, whom James Crewe knew from a previous berth. A man who was, presumably, aboard for the Hamburg voyage. I did not see him on the foredeck this morning, which may mean nothing, and may mean something. How do we find him?" "The way one finds a sailor between voyages," Holmes said simply. "One finds the public houses nearest the water, and one asks the right questions in the right order." He glanced at me with that quick, luminous look that I had learned to associate with the point at which a case moves from the preliminary to the substantive. "I suggest we begin this afternoon. But first quote." He reached into his coat pocket and produced the broken compass, which he had, I now realized, brought with him without mentioning it. He held it flat in his palm, and we both looked at it in the gray February light. "Broken needle. Still casing. The ghost of true north. Lost. First," he said quietly, "I want you to notice something that I should have remarked upon last evening, and did not." He tilted the compass slightly. "The case. Examine the interior edge on the north side, where the compass would normally indicate." I looked, scratched into the brass on the interior edge of the casing, so faint that one would not see it without looking for it. The casing, so faint that one would not see it without looking for it, were 4 small characters, a letter and 3 numerals, H317. I looked up at Holmes. His expression was composed and entirely unreadable, which meant that whatever he made of those 4 characters, he had already decided that I was not yet to be told. "What does it mean?" I asked. "I am not certain," he said, which was, as I had learned over many years, not quite the same thing as not knowing. He closed his fingers around the compass, and we walked back from the river, into the cold and the smoke and the complicated machinery of London going about its business, while somewhere behind us the Hesperine rocked at her moorings, and the grey water moved beneath her hull, and whatever she carried in her hold and in her history waited in the dark. There is a geography to the waterfront public houses of Southwark and Bermondsey that does not appear on any map produced for the general public, but which is as precisely understood by those who use them as the chart of any navigable sea. Each establishment occupies its particular niche in the ecosystem of the docks, with the settled permanence of a creature perfectly adapted to its environment. The houses nearest the legal quays catering to the better class of merchant officer, where the gin is of tolerable quality, and the conversation includes, occasionally, topics other than the sea. Then, as one moves eastward and the wharves grow older, and the trade less regulated, a gradation downward through establishments of decreasing gentility and increasing frankness, until one arrives at the outermost reaches of the pool, where the houses are neither named nor numbered, and where the clientele regards the presence of a stranger with the particular comprehensive suspicion of people who have, collectively and individually, good reason for it. Holmes knew this geography as he knew most geographies of London's working life, not from books, but from the years of patient, curious immersion in the city's underside that had given him a knowledge of its habits and habitats as precise as any naturalist's knowledge of a terrain. He did not need to ask directions. He walked through the waterfront streets with the easy familiarity of a man returning to known ground, and I followed him through alleys that smelled of tar and fish and coal smoke, past warehouses that rose like cliffs on either side, past groups of men working and men idle and men who were doing something that was neither one nor the other, until he stopped before a narrow doorway set into a wall of blackened brick, above which a weathered board bore the image of an anchor and the legend, barely legible, the kedge and pennant. "In here," he said, and went in without ceremony. The interior of the kedge and pennant was a single long room of the kind that appears to have been assembled from whatever materials were available at the time of construction, and then modified over subsequent decades by the addition of further materials of equal miscellaneity. The ceiling was low, the lighting was provided by 4 oil lamps of varying age and efficiency, and the smell was a dense and specific compound of tobacco, river mud, spilled ale, and the residual exhalation of a great many working men in a small space not unpleasant exactly, if one approached it in the spirit of an atmosphere rather than a condition. There were perhaps 15 men in the room at that hour of the morning, which said something about the nature of the establishment's clientele and the irregularity of their working hours. Most were in the mid-range of working age, with the weathered look of men who spend their days outdoors in all conditions. Several had the particular rolling ease about their posture and their manner of taking up space that I had come to recognize, from the previous day's visit to the Hesperine, as characteristic of men accustomed to the movement of a ship's deck beneath them. Holmes crossed to the bar with no hesitation and ordered 2 glasses of the house's ale, which arrived in pewter pots of considerable antiquity and acceptable content. He did not immediately survey the room in the conspicuous way of a man searching for someone. He simply stood at the bar and drank and listened, which is a very different thing, and which produced results within approximately 4 minutes. The name came to us from a conversation 3 feet to our left, between 2 men in heavy coats who were discussing, with the resigned specificity of people who have been discussing the same matter for some time, the question of who was to blame for a missed tide the previous week. One of them mentioned Hannigan as having been present at the relevant moment, and therefore available for allocation of the relevant responsibility. Holmes set down his pot and turned to them with the pleasant, unhurried manner he adopted for these introductory approaches. "I beg your pardon, did you say Hannigan? Seamus Hannigan, off the Hesperine?" The 2 men looked at him with the frank, unembellished assessment of people who do not trouble to conceal their assessments. "What's it to you?" The nearer one said, not aggressively, but with the directness of a working waterfront, where conversational preamble is regarded as a sign of something to hide. "Nothing of any consequence," Holmes said. "I have a message for him from his sister in Wicklow. She's been trying to reach him, and the company doesn't give out addresses." He said it easily, in the tone of a man relaying a minor domestic inconvenience, and I noted that he had introduced, with considerable economy, 2 things calculated to disarm: family and distance. A message from a sister in Ireland is the most innocent possible reason for seeking a man. The 2 workers exchanged a brief glance of the kind that conveys, between people who know each other well, a rapid, silent conference. Then the nearer one jerked his head toward the far end of the room. "Corner table. behind the stove. Hannigan was a man of perhaps 35, slight and dark, with the narrow, watchful face of someone who has learned to be small in a world that tends to overlook small men, and to use that overlooking to advantage. His eyes, when they came up to meet ours as we approached, were a very dark brown, and were, I thought, somewhat less surprised by our arrival than they ought to have been, as if he had been watching the room with sufficient attention to have tracked our progress from the door without appearing to do so. He had a glass of something darker than ale in front of him, and he did not move as we sat down across from him uninvited. He simply looked at us, taking us in with the same rapid, comprehensive assessment I had observed in Pardieu, but with a quality beneath it that was quite different. Pardieu's eyes had been calculating. Hannigan's were afraid. "Mr. Hannigan," Holmes said quietly, "we are not from the police, and we are not from the company. We are acting on behalf of Arthur Crewe." Something happened in Hannigan's face that I shall attempt to describe accurately, because it struck me at the time as significant and has continued to seem so in retrospect. It was not relief, and it was not increased fear, but a peculiar, complex combination of both, as if he had been dreading one kind of arrival and had received another kind, and was not yet certain whether the substitution was an improvement. He looked at Holmes for a long moment. Then he picked up his glass and drank from it slowly and set it down. "James is dead," he said. It was not a question. "You knew?" I said. "Word travels on the water," he said simply. "By yesterday morning everyone along the pool knew there'd been a body pulled from the river below Blackfriars. Word of who it was followed by noon." He turned his glass slowly in his hands, a gesture that reminded me painfully of Holmes turning the broken compass. "I've been sitting here since yesterday afternoon wondering whether to do something about it." "And have you reached a conclusion?" Holmes asked. Hannigan looked at him with those dark, frightened eyes. "That depends on who's asking and why." "I have told you who is asking," Holmes said. "The why is this. James Crewe is dead, and his father knows it was not an accident, and he has come to us to find the truth of it. Whatever you know, Mr. Hannigan, is relevant to that truth, and I think you know considerably more than you have told anyone." A long silence. The stove beside us ticked with the sound of hot metal contracting. From the bar, the low, continuous sound of other men's conversations provided a cover that was, I suspected, one of the reasons Hannigan had chosen this particular corner. "If I talk to you," Hannigan said at last, his voice dropped to something barely above the ambient noise, "and they find out I talked, it's not just my position on the ship. You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand," Holmes said, "and I will tell you plainly. I cannot promise you complete safety, because I do not yet know the full dimensions of what we are dealing with. What I can promise is discretion, and the serious application of my best efforts to ensure that whoever is responsible for James Crewe's death answers for it, which is, I suspect, the only outcome that will actually make you safe." Hannigan looked at him for another long moment. Then, with the air of a man stepping off a high ledge and committing to the fall, he nodded once. "The Hamburg run," he said. "We didn't go to Hamburg." The words fell into the conversation with the precise weight of something that has been held for a long time and is finally set down. Holmes said nothing. He waited. "We went north," Hannigan said. "Up the coast, past the Tyne, past the Forth, all the way north to a place called Gull Cove on the Caithness coast. You won't find it on the commercial charts. It's a deep-water inlet natural harbor, invisible from the sea lanes, no settlement within 4 miles. He turned his glass again. "We met another vessel there, a Dutch steam yacht called the Vrouw Mariek, private registry, no company markings. We transferred cargo. Boxes sealed, heavy. About 60 of them moved by winch in the night. Then we turned south and spent 9 days making our way back on a course that avoided the major sea lanes until we were within range of the Thames, and then came in as if we'd had weather." I looked at Holmes. His face was perfectly composed, but I could see in the set of his jaw and the quality of his stillness that whatever he had expected, this was more specific and more serious than the working hypothesis had been. "What was in the boxes?" Holmes asked. "I don't know." Hannigan met his gaze steadily. "I was a deckhand on the winch. No one told us what we were moving, and no one who valued their position would ask." A pause. "But I heard things. At night, sounds from the hold during the return voyage. Not mechanical sounds, not cargo settling." He stopped. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "What kind of sounds?" Hannigan's jaw tightened. "Movement," he said. "Irregular. And once, just once, the night before we reached the Thames, a sound that I told myself was the wind in the rigging. because that was easier than the alternative. What was the alternative? I asked, though I thought I already knew. Hannigan looked at me. A voice, he said. One voice very faint from somewhere below the main hold. Not a word, just a sound, like someone calling out very far down and then stopping. He looked back at his glass. I told James about it. He was the one who made me think I hadn't imagined it. He'd heard something, too, the night before from a different part of the ship. He was the one who— He stopped. Who tried to investigate? Holmes said quietly. He went below, Hannigan said, the second night after we left Gull Cove. He told me he was going to find out what was in those boxes, that if it was what he thought it was, he couldn't just let it alone. I told him to leave it. I told him. The muscles in his jaw worked. I told him that men who asked questions on that ship did not ask them for long, and I was not speaking in metaphor. He knew that. He went anyway. What did he find? He never told me. He came back up after about an hour, and he was different, quiet in a way that was not his usual quiet. He wouldn't speak of it. For the rest of the voyage he was careful and correct and said nothing to anyone that was not strictly required. Hannigan looked up. But that night, the last night before we reached the Thames, I saw Pardue come out of the captain's cabin, and the captain's face when he came out after Pardue was the face of a man who has been given an instruction he finds distasteful but will carry out. The stove ticked. Outside, somewhere distant, a steam whistle sounded on the river, one long note, carrying across the cold air with the clarity that cold gives to sounds. James left the ship on Saturday evening with the rest of us, Hannigan said. I last saw him on the gangway. He stopped, and something moved in his face that was not quite grief, but was adjacent to it the expression of a man replaying a moment that has become, in retrospect, a lost thing. He said, Hannigan, I think I know what to do about it. I think I finally know. And then he walked off down the wharf, and I went to my lodgings, and the next morning they were pulling him out of the river. Holmes sat back. He asked after a moment, the Dutch vessel, the Vrouw Mariek. Did you see a captain or crew? At a distance. It was dark, and the transfer was done fast. But I saw one man who seemed to be in charge on their side, tall, well-dressed for a working vessel, gave his orders in English with no accent I could place. He paused, and there was a mark on the side of their vessel, a painted mark, not the ship's name. I didn't know what it was. Can you describe it? Hannigan thought for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced a stub of pencil and a fold of paper, the kind of man, I thought, who kept such things habitually and sketched quickly. He slid the paper across to Holmes. It was a simple shape, a circle divided by a horizontal line. Below the line, 3 small marks evenly spaced, like teeth. Holmes looked at it for a long moment. Then he folded it and placed it in his pocket without comment. Mr. Hannigan, he said, where are you staying? Hannigan gave the name of a lodging-house in Bermondsey. Holmes nodded. I would strongly suggest that you do not return to the Hesperine in the interim, and that you are not to be found at your usual haunts for the next several days. Do you have somewhere else you can go, somewhere not known to the ship's company? Hannigan's eyes sharpened. You think they'll come for me? I think they came for James' crew, Holmes said with a precision that was, in its way, a kindness, the kindness of a man who respects another enough to be honest with him. And I think the difference between you and James' crew, at present, is that they are not certain what you know. The moment they become certain, or the moment they decide that uncertainty itself is sufficient reason, I should not like you to be findable at that moment. Hannigan held his gaze for a beat. Then he nodded once, with the contained composure of a man who has made a decision and intends to live by it. I have a cousin in Deptford, he said. She doesn't know the ship. Go there this evening, Holmes said. Not before dark. Do not go to your lodgings first, go to your cousin's directly. Send word to the address on this card. He produced one of his own, the real one this time, and do not speak of our conversation to anyone. We walked back from the Kedge and Pennant in a different kind of silence than the one that had accompanied our walk to it. That silence had been the silence of a case still taking shape. This was the silence of a case that has suddenly become serious in a way that was not quite anticipated. People, I said, when we had walked long enough that I could no longer hold it in. He heard a voice, Holmes, from the hold. Yes, Holmes said. Then what we are dealing with is not merely smuggling. No, Holmes said. It is not. He walked several more paces. The mark on the Dutch vessel, I have seen it before, or something very like it. "Not recently. Some years ago, in connection with a matter that was handled by certain government departments and which, for reasons that were explained to me at the time in some detail, was not to be publicized." He paused. "If the connection is what I now suspect it to be, Watson, this case extends considerably beyond the death of one young man, and the people involved in it are not people who will respond well to being investigated. I let that settle. Should we go to Lestrade?" Holmes was quiet for a long moment. "Not yet," he said at last. "Lestrade is a good man in his way, and he will do his duty as he understands it. But his understanding of this matter at present would lead him to conclusions that might warn the wrong people before we are ready." He glanced at me. "There is someone else I must consult before we go further. Tonight, if possible." He said a name that I shall not set down here, for reasons that will become clear in due course. But I noted that he said it with a particular combination of respect and something approaching reluctance, the tone of a man who is going to ask a favor from someone whose favors are not given lightly and are not without cost. "In the meantime," he said, "I want you to look into the Callaway Shipping Company. Their registered office, their directors, their financial history for the past 3 years. The sort of thing that is publicly available if one knows where to look, and asks the right clerks the right questions. Can you do that tomorrow morning?" "Of course," I said. He nodded, and we walked on through the cold and the coal smoke, and I thought about a voice in the hold of a dark ship, and a young man who had gone below to find the truth of it, and had not survived the finding. And I thought about a circle divided by a line, and 3 marks below it like teeth, pointing downward. And I found that I did not very much want to know what they meant. I have known Sherlock Holmes to be absent from Baker Street for periods of 3 days and more without explanation or advance notice, returning with mud on his boots, exhaustion in the set of his shoulders, and an absolute unwillingness to discuss where he had been or what he had done, until such time as he judged the information relevant. I have learned across the years of our association to accept these absences without the anxiety they once produced in me, to treat them as a feature of the arrangement rather than a violation of it, as one learns to treat the eccentricities of an unusual clock. The thing keeps accurate time regardless of the noise it makes in doing so. But when Holmes said that night, pulling on his coat with the particular focused efficiency that means he has somewhere to be and intends to be there promptly, that he would be back before midnight and that I was not to wait up, I felt something that I can only describe as unease of a specific and informed kind. It was not the general unease of a friend departing into the London night. It was the unease of a man who has listened to what Hannigan told us, who has seen the mark on the Dutch vessel, who has watched Holmes's face when he said the words government departments with that combination of knowledge and reluctance, and who understands, from those data points, that wherever Holmes was going that evening, it was not a casual call. I did wait up. I told myself I would not, and I sat by the fire with a medical journal, and I waited up none the less. Holmes returned at 20 minutes past 11, and said nothing of where he had been, and I said nothing of having waited. The following morning I rose early and set about the task Holmes had given me. The registered office of the Callaway Shipping Company proved, after an hour's consultation with the relevant directories and company registers at Somerset House, to be located in a respectable but undistinguished set of offices in Leadenhall Street, the kind of address that says established commerce without making any more specific claims. The company had been registered 11 years previously, with 3 directors listed at the time of formation. A Mr. George Alborn I noted the surname with interest, a Mr. Frederick Crane, and a 3rd individual listed as Cornelius Vane. George Alborn, the same surname as Captain Robert Alborn of the Hesperine. A family connection, then, between the ship's captain and the company's founding director, and a connection that had not been volunteered by Pardieu when Holmes had mentioned the captain's name. I pursued the financial records as far as they were publicly accessible, which was not as far as I should have liked. The company appeared on the surface of its accounts to be a modest but solvent operation running at a profit in 7 of its 11 years, with the remaining 4 showing losses that were, in the language of the documents, attributed to adverse trading conditions. There was nothing obviously irregular in what I could see, but I noted, because Holmes had asked me to note such things, that the volume of the company's declared trade had increased considerably in the past 3 years, almost doubled, in fact without any corresponding increase in the size of its fleet. The Hesperine remained its only registered vessel, A company that doubles its revenue without expanding its means of generating revenue is either remarkably efficient or is declaring only a portion of what it earns. I copied what I could and was back at Baker Street by early afternoon, to find Holmes sitting in his chair in the attitude I associated with serious internal calculation, coat still on, hat on the table beside him, eyes fixed on the middle distance with that bright, cold, inward attention. He looked up when I entered, and I saw, before his face settled into its customary composure, something that I had seen perhaps a half-dozen times in our association, and which always gave me pause, a controlled but genuine concern. Not the intellectual excitement of a difficult problem, but something more personal than that, the expression of a man who has received information that troubles him at a level deeper than professional interest. "Sit down, Watson," he said. "Tell me what you found," I told him. When I mentioned the name George Alborn, he nodded once, the nod of a man receiving confirmation rather than new intelligence. When I described the revenue anomaly, he was still for a moment and then said, very quietly, 3 years. The increase begins approximately 3 years ago, yes. That is consistent, he said, though with what he did not immediately say. I put down my notebook. "Holmes, last night who did you see?" He looked at me for a moment with that evaluating quality, the look of a man deciding how much of the truth is useful. Then, "I saw a man who has access to certain intelligence that is not available through the normal channels of inquiry. A man whose position requires him to know about organized criminal operations of a particular kind, operations that cross national boundaries." He paused. "He confirmed what I suspected about the mark on the Dutch vessel." "And what did you suspect?" Holmes rose from his chair and went to the mantelpiece, where he stood with his back to me, looking at the small collection of objects arranged there with the unseeing focus of a man ordering his thoughts. "There is," he said carefully, "a network, or there has been, for the past 4 years at minimum, operating between the ports of northwestern Europe and the British coastline. It is not a smuggling operation in the conventional sense. It does not deal in contraband goods. A pausa. It deals in people." I sat very still. Outside, the February wind moved along Baker Street and rattled the window in its frame, and I thought of a voice in the dark hold of the Hesperine, faint and urgent, and then suddenly silent. "People," I said. "Individuals, men, women, occasionally entire families who have reason to leave certain places with great urgency and without the knowledge of certain authorities. Some of them are political, dissidents, reformers, those who have made powerful enemies in their own countries. Some are rather less respectable. The network moves them for a fee from the continent to locations along the British coast, from which they disperse into the country or, in some cases, are moved on by other means." Holmes turned from the mantelpiece. "The mark on the Vrouw Marieke is the operating symbol of this network. It is known in the intelligence my contact possesses as the divided circle. I absorbed this, and is it I mean to say, is the British government opposed to it? If the people being transported are political refugees, the British government's position," Holmes said, with a precision that suggested he was choosing his words very carefully indeed, "is complex. Some of those being moved are people whose relocation to Britain would be welcomed by certain departments. Others are decidedly not, and the operation itself, being conducted outside all legal frameworks and involving necessarily the evasion of customs and immigration authorities, is technically illegal regardless of the sympathies of any individual transported." He sat back down. "But here is the element that my contact regards as most significant, and which I confess alters my understanding of the case considerably." "Go on," I said. "The divided circle has, in the past 18 months, undergone what my contact describes as a change in character. Originally, the individuals transported were primarily what I have described, refugees of one kind or another, paying very large sums for passage and discretion. But more recently, the intelligence suggests that the network has begun accepting cargo and clients of a different nature. Individuals who are not fleeing anything but who are being moved, without their consent." He let the words settle. "At least 3 cases in the past year in which persons have been reported missing in European cities and have subsequently, through the painstaking work of a German detective of some ability, whose name I shall not reproduce here, been traced to a port of entry on the British coast and then lost entirely." I stared at him. "Kidnapping," I said. "That is what James' crew heard in the hold. Those were not refugees. Some of them may have been," Holmes said, The network appears to have maintained its legitimate operation as cover for the less legitimate, which makes it very much harder to disentangle and very much more dangerous to oppose. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his grey eyes steady and serious. Watson, whoever controls the British end of this operation, the Callaway Shipping Company's directors, or those behind them, is not a common criminal. They are organized, they are wealthy, they have been operating successfully for years, and they have already, I am now certain, murdered one young man who got too close to the truth of what they are doing. Then we must go to the police, I said. Lestrade or higher than Lestrade? The police, Holmes said slowly, present a difficulty. He rose again. He was restless in a way I had rarely seen him, the contained energy of the problem pressing against its container. My contact informed me of something else last evening. There is reason to believe, not certainty, but reason that someone in a position of authority in this city is aware of the divided circle's operations and has chosen, for reasons my contact would not specify, to permit them to continue. He looked at me directly. Until I know who that person is and what their interest is, I cannot take this to the official authorities without risking that the information reaches the wrong ears before we are ready. The full weight of this settled over me like the February fog, heavy, obscuring, with the particular discomfort of something that cannot be simply walked out of. Then we are on our own, I said. For the present, Holmes said. And then, with a brief, precise quality that was his nearest approach to grimness, however, we are not without resources. He crossed to the table and laid out the things we had accumulated over the past 2 days. The broken compass, Hannigan's sketch of the divided circle mark, my notes from Somerset House. He stood looking at them as a general might look at a map of terrain, not with uncertainty, but with the focused, calculating attention of a man planning a campaign. George Alborn, he said, founding director of the Callaway Shipping Company. What else did the registers give you? An address in Highgate, listed at the time of the company's formation. Whether he still resides there, I cannot say. And Cornelius Vane? I consulted my notes. No address given that I could find in the public records. The name appears only in the company registration and then not again in any subsequent filing. He may have resigned from the directorship early on, or he may never have existed in any meaningful sense, Holmes said, and the name may be a convenience. A directorship held by a fiction is a common enough device for those who wish to have a controlling interest without a visible one. He picked up the broken compass and turned it in his hand. The inscription, H317. I have been considering it since yesterday. And? H could be a name initial, a place initial, or an operational designation. The numbers 317 could be a date, a birth number, a room number, or a sequence of some other kind entirely. He set the compass down. But I think, and this is a conjecture that I am not yet prepared to advance as anything more, that H refers to a location. A specific location that James Crewe either knew about or discovered during his time below decks on the return voyage. A location where someone or several someones were delivered, Holmes said. Not Gull Cove, that was the transfer point, the final destination. And if I am right about what H means in this context, I know roughly where to look. He paused. But I want to be certain before I commit us in that direction. There is one more piece of information I require, and I believe I know how to obtain it. He said nothing more about what that piece of information was, or how he intended to obtain it, and I had the feeling familiar, and not entirely comfortable of being shown only the part of a map that I was immediately standing on, while Holmes held the remainder folded in his coat pocket. That afternoon brought an unexpected development. I was at my desk reviewing my notes, when Mrs. Hudson knocked and announced a visitor, a young woman, she said, well-dressed, who had given no name but had said the matter was urgent. I told her to show the visitor up, and there entered our sitting-room a woman of about 30, handsome in a dark, precise way, dressed in good travelling clothes that had the appearance of having been put on quickly and without the usual care. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking between myself and the empty chair where Holmes usually sat. "Where is Mr. Holmes?" she asked. Her accent was educated English, with something beneath it that I could not place a faint overlay that might have been acquired rather than native. "He is expected shortly," I said. "I am his colleague, Dr. Watson. Please sit down. May I ask your name?" She sat, and she looked at her gloved hands for a moment before she looked at me. "My name is Elspeth Vane," she said. "My father was Cornelius Vane." I kept my face very still. "Was," I said. "He died 8 months ago," she said. in circumstances that I was told were natural and which I have never believed." She looked up, and in her dark eyes I saw the same quality I had seen in Arthur Crewe's face when he first came to Baker Street, the particular, focused grief of a person who has spent months being certain of something they cannot prove. "I have been trying to find a way to speak to Mr. Holmes for some time. I was told by someone I shall not name here that a young man called Crewe had been found in the river, and that it was connected to the same people who killed my father, and that Mr. Holmes had been engaged." A pause. "Is that true?" "We are investigating James Crewe's death," I said carefully. "As to the connection you suggest, I cannot speak to that at present." "Then let me speak to it," she said, with a quiet firmness that reminded me, unexpectedly, of Holmes himself. "My father was a founding director of the Callaway Shipping Company. He came to me 6 weeks before he died, and told me he had discovered that the company was being used for something he had not known about and could not condone. He was going to go to the authorities." Her jaw tightened slightly. "He died of a heart attack, according to the doctor who attended him. He was 53 years old and had never had a day's cardiac trouble in his life." I thought of James Crewe going below decks in the dark, driven by the same compulsion, the compulsion of a person who has found something intolerable and cannot leave it alone. "Miss Vane," I said, "when Mr. Holmes returns he will want to speak with you. In the meantime, did your father leave any documents? Any record of what he had found?" She reached into the traveling bag on her lap and produced a small, sealed envelope. She held it for a moment, and I saw, in that moment's hesitation, all the weight of 8 months of carrying something alone and being afraid. "He left me this," she said, "with instructions to give it only to someone I trusted completely when the time was right." She set it on the table between us. "I think the time is now." The envelope sat on the table. Outside, Baker Street was going about its afternoon business, cabs and footsteps, and the distant cry of a street seller, ordinary London, unconcerned and continuous, entirely unaware that in a sitting-room above it, the pieces of something very serious were assembling themselves into a shape that was only just beginning to be legible. I heard Holmes's step on the stairs. The door opened. He saw the envelope. He saw Miss Vane, and he was still for a half-second the precise, fractional stillness of a man who has walked into a room expecting one thing and received another, and is rapidly recalculating. "Then, Miss Vane," he said, as if he had known she was coming. Perhaps he had. With Holmes one could rarely be certain. He crossed to his chair, sat down, and looked at the envelope on the table. Then he looked at her. "Tell me about your father," he said, "from the beginning, and leave nothing out. There are moments in the course of an investigation when the accumulation of evidence reaches a kind of critical mass, when the separate threads of inquiry, which have been running parallel and apparently unconnected, suddenly converge at a single point with a force that is almost physical in its effect. I have experienced this sensation perhaps a dozen times in my years with Holmes, and it is never quite what one expects. One imagines that revelation will feel like clarity, a light switched on in a dark room, everything suddenly legible. In practice it feels more like the moment of a ship striking a sandbar. A sudden, jarring arrest of forward motion, the whole vessel shuddering with the impact of the unexpected solid thing. The opening of Cornelius Vane's envelope was such a moment. Holmes held it for a time without opening it. He turned it in his long fingers, examining the seal plain red wax. No impression, the paper good quality, watermarked, the kind used for private correspondence rather than commercial communication, and the handwriting on the front, which read simply, in a precise and slightly cramped hand, "For whoever has the courage to use it." He glanced at Miss Vane. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back very straight, and she looked at the envelope with the expression of a person who has been carrying a weight and is about to set it down and does not yet know whether the setting down will bring relief or something worse. "Your father wrote this," Holmes said, "6 weeks before he died. He gave it to me in person, at our house in Islington. He told me—" She paused, and something in her voice acquired the careful quality of a person quoting accurately because accuracy matters. "He told me, if anything happens to me, give this to someone who will know what to do with it. Not the police. Someone who operates outside the ordinary machinery." A pause. "He had heard of you, Mr. Holmes. He had followed several of your cases in the press. I think he had you in mind when he said it." Holmes said nothing to this. He broke the seal with his thumb and opened the envelope. Inside were 2 items. The first was a single sheet of paper, covered on both sides in the same cramped, precise hand as the address. The second was a smaller piece, older, more worn, that appeared to have been cut from some other document, its edges irregular, suggesting it had been removed in haste from a larger page. Holmes read both in silence, with the absolute stillness of a man for whom reading is not a passive act, but an active one, engaging the text with the same focused attention he brought to a crime scene or a witness's face. I watched him read, and I watched his face, and I saw 2 things in the course of that reading that I noted carefully. The first was a brief, almost imperceptible tightening about the eyes when he was approximately 2/3 through the letter, the look of a man who has encountered a detail that was not expected, and that changes the arrangement of what came before. The second was, at the very end, a stillness that was different in quality from his ordinary stillness, deeper and more deliberate, as if he were pressing something down. He set the papers on the table and looked at Miss Vane. "Your father," he said, "was more thorough than whoever killed him gave him credit for." She received this without visible reaction, which I thought required considerable composure. "What does it say?" "I will tell you what is relevant to your safety and to the progress of this investigation," Holmes said. "Some of what is here I shall keep to myself for the present, for reasons that I hope you will accept on trust." He looked at her steadily. "Your father discovered the true nature of the Callaway Shipping Company's operations approximately 10 months before his death. He had been a passive director drawing a nominal fee, attending the occasional meeting, under the impression that he was a minor partner in a legitimate coastal trading concern. He became suspicious when the company's accounts, which he began examining more carefully in the last year of his life, showed the revenue anomaly that Dr. Watson has independently identified income that could not be accounted for by the declared trade. "He said something of the kind," she said quietly. "That the numbers didn't add up. They did not." He pursued the discrepancy carefully and privately, and arrived at a partial understanding of what the company was doing. He identified the divided circle. He uses a different name for it, but the description is unmistakable. And he identified the principal architect of the British end of the operation. Holmes paused. "His name is in this letter, and it is not George Alborn, and it is not a man called Pardue." I leaned forward. "Who then?" Holmes picked up the smaller, cut piece of paper and held it so that I could see it. It appeared to be a fragment of a letter or memorandum, the text beginning mid-sentence at the top and cut off again at the bottom. The handwriting was different from Vane's, larger, more confident, with the particular fluency of a man accustomed to writing quickly and at volume. I could read approximately 3 lines of it before Holmes turned it back toward himself. What I read in those 3 lines was enough to make me sit back in my chair and look at Holmes with an expression that must have been, to an observer, fairly eloquent. "Good God," I said. "Yes," Holmes said, "but that means that the position I described to you yesterday regarding a person of authority who is aware of the network and has chosen to permit it is rather more specifically situated than my contact's intelligence suggested." Holmes set the fragment down. He looked at it for a moment. "Your father, Miss Vane, did not go to the police because he understood from what he had found that the relevant authorities had been managed. He came very close to the truth." A pause. "Closer, I think, than he knew." Vane looked at him with those steady dark eyes. "And this is why he was killed." "I believe so." "And James Crewe was killed for the same reason." "James Crewe had the misfortune of being an honest man in the wrong place," Holmes said, "and the further misfortune of being the kind of honest man who cannot leave a wrong thing alone." He said it without sentiment, but with a quality of recognition, as if he were describing something he understood from the inside. He discovered what the Hesperine was carrying, and he intended to do something about it. Someone aboard that vessel informed the people above them, and those people acted quickly. "Pardue," I said. "Almost certainly as the instrument, not as the authority." Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at the grey afternoon street below. "The authority is the name in this letter, and the name in this letter is the reason I have not gone to Scotland Yard." He turned back to the room. "Miss Vane, I need to ask you something that may be painful. In the weeks before your father died, did he mention anyone by name? Anyone connected to the company whom he spoke of with particular unease?" She thought carefully. The care with which she thought told me that she had been over this ground many times in the past 8 months and knew its contours well. "He mentioned George Alborn once said he was a weak man who did what he was told." and he mentioned someone he called the conductor, though I assumed at the time that was a kind of nickname or code." Holmes turned sharply from the window. "The conductor," he said. "He used that exact word?" "Yes," he said. "The conductor of this enterprise is a man who has made himself invisible by making himself indispensable." She frowned slightly. "I did not understand it then?" "I begin to understand it now," Holmes said, very quietly, and in a tone that made me look at him with some attention. He was standing very still again, in the manner of a man who has just placed the last piece of a mechanical puzzle, and is watching the mechanism move for the first time. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and then he was in motion, crossing to the table, picking up the papers, folding them with precise care, and placing them in the inside pocket of his coat. "Miss Vane," he said, "you will not return to your house in Islington tonight." She looked at him with the startled attention of someone who has expected a question and received an instruction. "I beg your pardon? If the people behind your father's death have become aware that you exist as a potential source of evidence, and given that you have been making inquiries, it is not impossible that they have, then your house is not safe." He said it in the flat, matter-of-fact way he said dangerous things, as if the danger were a weather condition to be noted and planned around, rather than a thing to be alarmed by. "Is there some way you can stay a friend, a relative whose connection to you is not easily traced?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then my mother's cousin in Clapham. We are not close. No one in my father's circle would know of her. Go there this evening. Directly from here, do not go home first. If you need things from your house, send word and Dr. Watson or I will arrange to have them fetched." He looked at her with a steadiness that was, I thought, intended to be reassuring and largely succeeded. "This will not last long. The situation is approaching a resolution more rapidly than I initially expected. But the approach to that resolution is the most dangerous part, and I need you out of the way of it." She stood and gathered her bag and looked at Holmes with an expression in which I could see, beneath the composure, the accumulated weight of 8 months of solitary certainty. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "will you find out who did this?" "To my father." "To James Crewe?" "Yes," Holmes said, simply and without qualification. It was the first unhedged promise I had heard him make in the course of the case, and I noted that he made it without apparent difficulty, which told me that whatever he had seen in Vane's letter, it had given him a certainty he had not previously possessed. After she had gone, escorted to a cab by my own arrangement, I returned to the sitting-room to find Holmes standing at the table, looking at the objects assembled there with the expression of a commander surveying a field before the order to advance. "The name," I said, "in the letter. Are you going to tell me?" He looked at me. "Not yet. Holmes Watson." His voice was not unkind, but it was final. "There's one more thing I need to verify before I speak that name aloud, even to you. Not because I distrust you, you are the last man alive of whom I could say that, but because names have a gravity of their own. Once spoken, they cannot be unspoken, and the knowledge of a name changes the way one looks at things, sometimes in ways that are not useful." He paused. "By tomorrow evening I will have what I need, and then I will tell you everything." I accepted this not because I was entirely comfortable with it, but because I had, over many years, developed a faith in Holmes's judgment that was based not on deference but on evidence, on the accumulated record of cases in which his decision to withhold information at a particular stage had proved, in retrospect, to be exactly the right decision. He was not secretive from arrogance or from a love of theatre. He was secretive because he had discovered, through long practice, that premature certainty is one of the most dangerous things in an investigation, that a mind told the answer too early stops asking the right questions. And so I did not press him further on the name. What happened that night, however, made the question considerably less abstract. It was shortly after 10 o'clock when the knock came at our door, not the measured, considered knock of a client, but the urgent staccato knock of someone who has been moving fast, and has arrived out of breath. Holmes was at his violin, and I was reading, and we exchanged a look before Mrs. Hudson's step sounded on the stair. The man she showed up was a constable I did not recognize, young, pink-cheeked, with the look of someone who has been sent somewhere on an errand, and is not entirely certain of the protocol for delivering it. He had a note in his hand, and he held it out to Holmes with the combination of deference and urgency that suggests the sender is someone who commands deference. Holmes read the note. His face, as he read it, showed nothing. Then he handed it to me. It was from Inspector Lestrade, short, with the characteristic economy of a man who writes what is necessary and no more. Holmes' body found at Pelham's Wharf, Bermondsey. A sailor, Irish by his effects, name Hannigan. Appears to have gone into the water from the wharf side, possibly late evening. Come if you can. I read it twice. The words did not change. Holmes had already put on his coat. His face, as he picked up his hat and gloves, was not the face of a man surprised, and that more than the note itself. More than the name in it was the thing that settled into me with a cold and heavy certainty. "You expected this," I said. "I feared it," he said, which was not quite the same thing, and which was from Holmes a distinction of considerable significance. "I told him to go to his cousin in Deptford this evening. Not before dark." He paused, his hand on the door. "He did not go before dark. He said nothing more. We went down into the night, into the cold and the fog and the smell of the river that reached us even here, 2 miles from the water, and I thought of Hannigan sitting in the corner of the kedge and pennant with his dark, frightened eyes and his glass and his terrible, costly decision to tell the truth. And I thought, whoever the conductor is, whoever holds the strings of this enterprise and moves its pieces, with such quiet and lethal precision he had known about Hannigan within hours of our conversation. Which meant someone had been watching the kedge and pennant, or watching us. I looked at Holmes's profile as we walked, sharp and certain in the gaslight. "Holmes," I said, "were we followed yesterday? To the public house?" He was quiet for 2 paces. Then, "It is possible," he said. "I took precautions, but the people we are dealing with have resources that make precautions less reliable than I should like." A pause. "It is also possible that Hannigan himself, before he came to the prudent decision to go to his cousin, went somewhere first, did something first. People under extreme stress do not always behave as reason would recommend." He glanced at me. "It does not change what I intend to do. It may change the speed at which I intend to do it." Pelham's Wharf was 20 minutes by cab, and we covered the distance in silence. The Thames at night in February is a thing of darkness and cold movement and the occasional lamp reflection broken and wavering on the black water. Lestrade was waiting for us at the wharf edge, his coat collar up and his expression carrying that particular combination of professional grimness and personal discomfort that a second body in a connected case always produces. "He was pulled out an hour ago," Lestrade said without preamble. "A night watchman on the far wharf saw something in the water and raised the alarm. By the time they got to him, he stopped. He was not a sentimental man, but the shorthand was sufficient. Holmes went to where the body lay covered on the wharf boards and knelt, and looked with the careful, unsentimental attention that was, in its way, a form of respect, the respect of a man who believes the dead have things to tell, if one listens correctly. I knelt beside him and looked with a doctor's eyes at what the river had returned. 35, slight dark. He had not been in the water long. There was a bruise at his right temple fresh, made before the entry into the water rather than after, and his coat was torn at the right shoulder in the way that suggested a grip, suddenly applied and suddenly released. Holmes said nothing for a long time. Then he reached into Hannigan's coat pocket methodically, as a surgeon moves, each gesture deliberate, and found what was there. A handful of coins, a folded paper that proved to be a letter in what appeared to be Irish, which Holmes pocketed without comment, and nothing else. "His lodging-house key," Holmes said to Lestrade. "It is not here." Lestrade frowned. "Could have fallen out in the water." "It could," Holmes said. He rose and looked out at the black river, and I could not see his face. "Or someone took it." He said nothing else at the wharf. In the cab back to Baker Street he sat without speaking, and I did not interrupt him, because I knew the quality of that silence. It was the silence of a man who has reached the point in a case where the intellectual and the moral have become the same thing, where finding the answer and stopping what is happening are no longer separate imperatives, but a single one, urgent and absolute. "Tomorrow," he said as we turned into Baker Street. "Early. There are 3 things I must do before noon, and after noon." He paused. "After noon, Watson, I think we will be in a position to move, and we will need to move quickly and carefully and together." "I am, as always, entirely at your disposal," I said. He glanced at me, and for a moment, just a moment, there was something in his face that was not quite the usual contained, self-sufficient composure. Something that was, I thought, something adjacent to gratitude. "I know," he said. "That, Watson, is the one constant in this business that I find I cannot do without." He said nothing more. Baker Street received us back into its familiar darkness, and the fire was low in the grate, and the broken compass sat on the table where we had left it, its needle pointing at nothing but the inscription, H317. I looked at it as I set down my coat, and I found for the first time that I thought I knew what the H stood for. I did not say so. I waited for morning, and for Holmes, and for whatever came next. I have remarked before in these pages upon the peculiar quality of Holmes's silences, and the several varieties of meaning they contain. But I have not, I think, previously attempted to describe the silence that descended upon Baker Street in the early hours of that February morning, the silence that followed our return from Pelham's Wharf, that outlasted the dying of the fire and the dimming of the lamps, and that was still present as a kind of residue, when I rose at 6:30 to find Holmes already up, already dressed, already gone. He had left a note on the breakfast table in his compact, decisive hand. "Watson, negative. Do not leave Baker Street before noon. Tell no one where I have gone. If Lestrade calls, say I am indisposed. I will explain everything this evening." There was beneath this a postscript. The H is Harwich. 317 is a berth number. If I am not back by 7, open the locked drawer of my desk, you know where the key is, and take what you find there to the address written on the blue envelope inside. Trust no one else with it. I sat with this note for a long time over my breakfast, which I ate without tasting. Harwich, a port town on the Essex coast, a natural point of arrival for vessels crossing from the continent. Berth 317. A specific location within that port where, if Holmes's reconstruction was correct, the human cargo of the Hesperine and vessels like her had been delivered and dispersed, and the instruction about the locked drawer delivered in the matter-of-fact tone Holmes used for all practical contingencies, as if the possibility of his not returning by 7 were simply a logistical variable to be planned for, no more alarming than the possibility of rain. I found that instruction considerably more alarming than he had apparently intended it to be, and I spent the morning in a state of contained unease that I managed, with some effort, by occupying myself with my medical notes and by resisting repeatedly the impulse to go to the desk and look at the locked drawer. Lestrade did call, as it happened, at 10:30, with the brisk energy of a man who has had a productive morning and wishes to share it. "Is Holmes in?" he said from the doorway. "He is unwell," I said, with the practised ease of a man who has told this particular lie enough times to have made it his own. "Nothing serious." He asked not to be disturbed. Lestrade received this with the expression of a man who suspects he is being managed and has decided, on balance, to permit it. "Well, you can tell him when he's feeling better that we've made an arrest. Pardieu, the first mate off the Hesperine. We've had him since this morning. I kept my face carefully arranged. On what charge? The murder of Seamus Hannigan, to begin with. The evidence is tidy enough. Pardieu's lodgings are 3 streets from Pelham's Wharf. A neighbor saw him returning late last night with wet boots and a torn coat sleeve, and we found Hannigan's lodging-house key in a coat pocket. Lestrade allowed himself a brief, satisfied nod. "I think when we pull on that thread we'll find it leads to young Crewe as well. Same method, same motive, the man knew too much." He looked at me with the direct, professionally confident gaze of a man who has done his job and knows it. "Tell Holmes, will you? I think he'll be pleased." "I'm sure he will," I said. After Lestrade had gone, I sat for a considerable time looking at the fire and thinking about what Holmes had said the previous evening. Pardieu as instrument, not as authority. And now Pardieu was in custody, and Lestrade was satisfied, and the conductor, whoever he was, the man invisible by virtue of being indispensable, was still at liberty and still invisible. I understood then why Holmes had said nothing to Lestrade about the contents of Vane's letter. And I understood, with a clarity that I found simultaneously illuminating and deeply uncomfortable, that the arrest of Pardieu might be the most dangerous thing that had yet happened in this case, not because it was wrong exactly, but because it was right in the wrong way, at the wrong time, and would announce to the man at the top of this enterprise that the net was drawing closer, without yet being drawn close enough. Holmes returned at 4:20 in the afternoon. He came through the door with the particular quality of contained momentum that I associated with a man who has covered a great deal of ground at speed, and is managing his fatigue through the force of a not yet exhausted purpose. His coat was travel-dusty, his boots were damp, and there was a quality about his eyes, a bright, focused intensity that told me clearly that his morning had produced what he had gone to find. He stopped when he saw my face. "Lestrade has arrested Pardieu," I said. "I know," he said. He crossed to his chair and sat, and extended his hands toward the fire with a weariness that was, for Holmes, an unusual admission. "I heard at London Bridge Station an hour ago. Word travels quickly when Scotland Yard is pleased with itself." "And," I said, "are you going to tell Lestrade he has the wrong man?" "Pardieu is not the wrong man," Holmes said. "He is simply not the only man, and not the important one." He looked into the fire. "If I go to Lestrade now and tell him to look beyond Pardieu, two things will happen. First, Lestrade will be skeptical, because the evidence against Pardieu is genuine, and my alternative will, at this stage, seem like elaboration for its own sake. Second, and this is the significant one, the conductor will become aware that his principal agent has been taken, and that the investigation is being pushed further. And he will act. He will run," I said. "Or worse," Holmes said, "he will not run. Men of his kind do not run. They are too embedded, too necessary, too certain of their own untouchability. What he will do is cover his tracks more thoroughly, and destroy whatever evidence remains, and we will lose him." He paused. "I need 48 hours. After that, Pardieu's arrest becomes useful. It is a pressure point that we can use at the right moment in the right way. You said this morning that we would be in a position to move afternoon," I said. "What happened in the morning? Where did you go?" He looked at me, and the look had the quality I had seen the previous evening, that decision about how much to say, and when. Then, apparently, he arrived at the conclusion that the time for managed disclosure was past. "3 places," he said. "First, to the General Register Office, where a clerk of my acquaintance, a man who owes me a considerable favor from an affair I shall not detail here, permitted me access to certain records not available to the general public. Second, to a building in Whitehall whose number I shall not give you, where I had a second conversation with the contact I visited 2 evenings ago, and where I was able to present the contents of Vane's letter and receive, in return, a confirmation that was the last piece I required." He paused. "And third, to Harwich." "Harwich," I said. "You went to Harwich and back this morning?" "The first train leaves Liverpool Street at 6:42. I was back in London before 3. He said it with the mild tone of a man reporting an unremarkable commute. "I needed to see berth 317 with my own eyes, and I needed to speak to a harbour master's assistant who is, by the happy coincidence of a case I worked 8 years ago in which his brother was the wrongly accused party, entirely disposed to be helpful to me." "And what did you find?" Holmes leaned forward and steepled his fingers in the familiar attitude of organized exposition. "Berth 317 at Harwich is a private mooring not used by the commercial traffic, not supervised by the main harbour authority. It is registered for the past 3 years to a company called the Meridian Transit Agency. The Meridian Transit Agency has as its sole director a man named Mr. George Albourne." "The captain's father," I said. "The captain's father. A man who, if one examines his background, turns out to have had a previous career of some interest 20 years in the consular service, postings in Rotterdam, Hamburg, and Riga, before a resignation in circumstances that the public record does not explain, but that my contact in Whitehall was able to illuminate." He paused. "He was asked to resign. There had been an investigation into the disappearance of funds from a relief program administered through the consulate in Riga, funds intended for the resettlement of displaced persons following a period of civil unrest in that region. The investigation was inconclusive. The funds were never recovered. Albourne resigned and came home to London, where he founded the Callaway Shipping Company 3 years later." I sat with this for a moment. "So the divided circle, the network, had originated with him?" "He has been doing this since his consular days. I believe the operation began in its current form approximately 4 years ago," Holmes said, "though its roots, and Albourne's personal history with the movement of persons for profit, are older. He used his contacts from the consular years people in Rotterdam, in Hamburg, to establish the network. The Hesperine is the British conveyance. The Vrouw Mariek is the continental connection." He looked at me directly. "But here is what I did not know until this morning, Watson, and what changes everything. George Albourne is not the conductor." I stared at him. "But Vane's letter names Albourne as the operational director of the company," Holmes said. "Which he is. The man who runs the shipping company, manages the logistics, handles the money. But the letter also contains the fragment the piece Vane cut from a document he had obtained at some personal risk from the company's private correspondence. And that fragment is a communication from someone above Albourne, someone who gives him instructions and to whom he reports, someone who provides the, shall we say, protection from official interference that has allowed this operation to continue for 4 years without serious investigation. He reached into his coat and produced the fragment, the smaller piece of paper, from Vane's envelope and held it out to me. I took it and read it properly this time, without Holmes's fingers limiting my view. It was 3 sentences cut from what appeared to be a longer letter. Arrangements at Harwich are satisfactory for the present. The matter of the Hamburg schedule should be handled through Aldbourne first, have any direct communication with the vessel or its officers. When the season's business is concluded, the usual disposal of records should proceed without exception, and beneath those 3 sentences a signature, not a full name, just initials, and a title. R.V.Dip. Assistent. Come. I looked up at Holmes. My mouth was, I think, slightly open, though I do not consider myself a man given to theatrical reactions. Deputy Assistant Commissioner, I said. Of the Metropolitan Police, Holmes said. The fire crackled. Outside, Baker Street went about its business, cabs and footsteps and the cry of a newspaper boy, the ordinary percussion of an ordinary London afternoon, entirely unconscious of itself. That is why you cannot go to Lestrade, I said. Lestrade reports through several layers to the Deputy Assistant Commissioner. Any inquiry that reaches the official channels will, before it reaches the level at which it can do any good, pass through or near the office of RVH. Holmes took the fragment back, folded it carefully. My contact in Whitehall knows this and has known it for some time. The reason the operation has not been shut down is not because it has not been discovered. It is because the man responsible for shutting it down is the man running it. I thought of Hannigan in the river, of James Crewe in the river before him, of Cornelius Vane dead of a convenient heart attack at 53, of whatever voices had cried out in the hold of the Hesperine on its return from Gull Cove, and had then gone silent. Who is he? I said. Rev. Hush. His name, Holmes said, is Rathbone Vickers Holt. He has been Deputy Assistant Commissioner for 6 years. He is regarded, within the Metropolitan Police, as one of its most effective senior officers, thorough, incorruptible, deeply committed to the rule of law. The precision with which he said this last phrase made it the most damning thing yet spoken in the case. He is also, it appears, the reason that 3 witnesses who stumbled upon the operations of the divided circle are dead, and the reason that an organized criminal network has been conducting what amounts to a trade in human beings for 4 years beneath the nose of every authority that should have stopped it. I was quiet for a long moment. Then, what do? We lay a trap, Holmes said, and for the first time in the entire course of the case, I heard in his voice something that was not quite cold, something that had an edge to it which, in a less controlled man, I would have called anger. Not for Pardieu, he is already caught. Not for Aldbourne, he is a secondary figure and will be dealt with in due course. For Holt. And the trap, Watson, must be of a particular kind, one that produces evidence so incontrovertible, so public, and so impossible to suppress or redirect that even the authority of a Deputy Assistant Commissioner cannot prevent its consequences. How? I said. He looked at me with those grey, luminous eyes, and the plan was already there. I could see it assembled and complete behind them, the way one sometimes sees the shape of a landscape in the moment before the fog clears. It begins tomorrow night, he said, and it requires you to do something that you will find disagreeable. What is that? Trust me, he said, without knowing the full plan. Because the full plan depends upon certain people believing certain things that are not true. And the most convincing performance of a belief is given by someone who holds it genuinely. He paused. I need you, Watson, to believe for the next 36 hours that we are going to Harwich to find evidence at berth 317, because that is exactly what I intend Holt to believe as well. And are we going to Harwich? The ghost of a smile, minimal, precise, and carrying in it a quality that I can only describe as the intellectual satisfaction of a man who has set a clock and wound the spring and is now simply waiting for the appointed hour. No, he said, we are not. That evening Holmes did something he had not done in the course of the case. He went to the telegraph office on Baker Street and sent 2 wires. He did not show me their contents, but he was gone for only 12 minutes, and returned with the thoughtful, slightly abstracted expression of a man who has set a mechanism in motion and is listening to its first movements. Then he sat at his violin for an hour, not the mournful, searching music of the intervals, but something precise and mathematical, Bach or something in that spirit, each note placed with the deliberateness of a man testing a structure for load-bearing integrity. At 9 o'clock a response arrived by messenger, a single word on a telegraph slip. Holmes read it, nodded once, and put it in the fire. "Well, the trap is set," he said. "There is one more actor whose cooperation I require, and I have it." He looked at me with an expression that was, for Holmes, quite open the expression, I thought, of a man who has worked alone for a long time and is, for once, conscious of not being alone. "Get some rest, Watson. Tomorrow will be a long day, and we shall need to be very clear-headed at the end of it." I went to bed. I did not sleep easily. In the room below I heard the violin resume, still precise, still mathematical, and then, after a long while, stop. And then silence of the particular quality that belongs to a man sitting alone in a lamplit room, holding the last piece of a plan in his mind, turning it over one final time to check for weaknesses before the morning comes and the time for checking is past. I lay in the dark and thought of Hannigan's dark eyes, frightened and then deciding. I thought of James Crewe going below decks with a lantern, knowing the risk and going anyway. I thought of Cornelius Vane handing his daughter an envelope and saying, "Give this to someone who will know what to do, someone who operates outside the ordinary machinery." I thought, we are that, Holmes and I. We are whatever stands in the gap between the machinery and the thing it cannot reach, or will not. I closed my eyes. Outside, London breathed its cold February breath, and somewhere in its depths a Deputy Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police went about his evening in comfortable certainty of a man who has never been caught and does not expect to begin now. He did not know about the trap. He did not know yet about us. I have, in the course of setting down these accounts, been asked on more than one occasion by editors, by readers who have taken the trouble to write, by the occasional acquaintance who has read one record or another, and felt moved to comment whether I ever resented Holmes's habitual practice of keeping me partially informed, whether the experience of being used as an instrument in a plan whose full dimensions were withheld from me was one that I found demeaning or frustrating, or in some other way objectionable. I have always answered honestly, number, not because I lacked the capacity for resentment, nor because I was indifferent to being treated as a chess piece rather than a player, but because I understood from long observation that Holmes's withholding was never casual and never contemptuous. It was always purposeful, always considered, and almost invariably in service of a goal that he could not achieve by any other means. He withheld from me on those occasions not because he thought less of me than of himself, but because he thought differently, because he required from me specifically the performance of a genuine belief, and he knew, as I knew, that genuine belief cannot be manufactured from full knowledge. I say all this now, looking back from the far side of the events of that final February day, because I want the reader to understand that what I felt during the 36 hours of Chapter 7's closing trap was not resentment and not confusion, but something more specific and more interesting. The sensation of being a necessary part of a mechanism whose full purpose I could not see, and choosing deliberately to trust the engineer. It was, I think, the correct choice, but it was not a comfortable one. Holmes was already at the breakfast table when I came down at 7 with a pot of coffee, a plate of kidneys that Mrs. Hudson had evidently been persuaded to produce at an unlikely hour, and a copy of the Morning Times folded to the shipping intelligence column. He looked, to any casual observer, like a man in a state of moderate contentment, relaxed, well-rested, engaged in the routine pleasures of a morning at Baker Street. To me, who had looked at that face across 1,000 breakfasts, he looked like a man who had not slept at all, and was choosing not to mention it. "Sit down," he said. "Eat something. We have a busy morning." I said. "Are you going to tell me the plan?" "Some of it," he said. "The part you need." He set down the newspaper and looked at me with the direct, clear gaze that he reserved for serious communication, the gaze that said, "Pay attention and remember this precisely. At 10 o'clock this morning," he said, "you will take a cab to the offices of the Daily Chronicle on Fleet Street and ask to see Mr. Gerald Price. You know Price? By reputation, the crime correspondent. A man of considerable ability and absolute discretion when discretion is called for, and absolute indiscretion when that is called for instead, the two qualities being, in a journalist of his type, perfectly under voluntary control. Holmes poured himself a second coffee. You will tell Price that you have information about a criminal operation of significant public interest, an operation involving the unlawful transportation of persons across the North Sea, with British participation at the highest level. You will tell him that the evidence will be available for his examination tomorrow morning, at an address I shall give you, and that if he brings a photographer and a shorthand writer, he will have the story of his career. I looked at him. And the address? Number 14 Calloway Lane, Harwich. He said it without inflection. Berth 317. So we were going to Harwich after all, or appeared to be. I filed this carefully because Holmes had told me the previous evening that we were not going to Harwich, and Holmes did not contradict himself accidentally. You want Price to publish the location, I said slowly. I want Price to have the location, Holmes said. Whether he publishes it and when depends on what tomorrow morning produces. But I want the information that a journalist has been told about Harwich and Berth 317 to be available. In the ecosystem of a newspaper office, information has a way of moving. He met my eyes. Do you follow me? I followed him. The Daily Chronicle's offices were not immune to the attentions of men who had reason to monitor what London's press was being told. If Holt had ears in the newspaper world, and a man in his position, who had maintained his operation for 4 years, would be extraordinarily negligent, not to then the information that a journalist had been pointed toward Harwich would reach him. He would believe that Holmes was about to expose the physical location of his operation. He would act to protect it, and that action, whatever form it took, would be the thing Holmes was waiting for. What will you be doing, I said, while I am at the Chronicle? Something that requires me to be someone else for a period of several hours, Holmes said with the composed simplicity of a man who regards the periodic assumption of other identities as a wholly unremarkable professional tool. I shall meet you back here at 2 o'clock. After that we go together, but not to Harwich. Where then? He looked at me with that measuring quality. Then, apparently concluding that this particular piece of information was both necessary and safe to share. To Holt's house, he said. In Kensington, at 4 o'clock this afternoon, when he will be at home and expecting a visitor who is not us. I absorbed this. You have arranged for him to receive a visitor. I sent 2 telegrams last evening. The first was to a man in Whitehall, my contact, who has agreed to facilitate a private communication from a source that Holt trusts, indicating that there is a matter requiring his personal attention at his home address at 4 o'clock today. A matter relating to the network. The source is credible enough that Holt will not question it, and urgent enough that he will not delay. He paused. The second telegram was to Miss Elspeth Vane in Clapham. I looked at him sharply. You are involving her? She has in her possession something that Holt does not know exists and would very much wish to see destroyed, Holmes said. Her father's letter, the fragment with the initials. He set down his coffee cup. I am not involving her in any operation that puts her at physical risk. I am asking her to be present in a safe location when the moment of confrontation arrives because she has a right to that, and because her testimony, given in person about the letter and the circumstances in which her father gave it to her, is a piece of evidence that no document alone can replicate. I thought of her sitting in our Baker Street chair, holding the sealed envelope with that quiet 8 months loaded composure. She will come, I said. She has already confirmed it, Holmes said. The reply to my telegram was 1 word. I was at the offices of the Daily Chronicle by 5 minutes past 10. Gerald Price was a compact, quick-eyed man of 50 with the particular alertness of a journalist who has spent 30 years in the habit of deciding, within the first 30 seconds of an encounter, whether the person in front of him is worth his full attention. I had it from the moment I gave him Holmes's name, which he received with the slight, involuntary brightening of a man who has been hoping to hear a particular word, and has just heard it. I told him what Holmes had instructed me to tell him. I gave him the address 14 Calloway Lane, Harwich, Berth 317. I told him to be there at 10 o'clock the following morning, with his photographer and his shorthand writer, and that he would have the documentation he needed. He asked 3 questions in rapid succession. Was this connected to James Crewe's death? Was there a government official involved? And was Holmes personally going to be present? I answered yes, and I believe so in that order, which was the most honest set of answers I could give. He shook my hand with a firmness that suggested he was already composing the headline. I was back at Baker Street by 11:30, and I spent the next 2 hours in a state of somewhat suspended animation, reading without absorbing, writing notes I did not look at again until Holmes's steps sounded on the stair at precisely 2 o'clock, as he had promised. He came in, and I looked at him, and for a moment I did not recognize him. He had, on some occasions I had witnessed, produced disguises of considerable elaborateness, false beards, altered postures, entire alternative identities complete with histories and regional accents. What he had done today was subtler and, in some ways, more startling. He had simply removed those qualities that made him unmistakably Holmes. The bearing was different, slightly stooped, less precisely economical. The face was the same face, but the expression that animated it was entirely different, an expression of ordinary, uninflected business. The face of a man with somewhere moderately important to be. The coat was a decade older than any he normally wore. The hat was wrong, not dramatically wrong, but wrong enough that the shape of his head, which is very distinctive, was partially altered. He was in himself inside 30 seconds, coat off, hat on the table. The familiar contained alertness back in every line of him, as if the other person had been a coat he had shrugged off. "Done," he said. "Price will be in Harwich tomorrow morning." He looked satisfied, not warmly satisfied, but the precise satisfaction of a mechanism performing as calibrated. "And by tomorrow morning Holt will know that Price has been told to go to Harwich. He will have spent this afternoon and evening in a state of controlled alarm, and by tomorrow morning he will have done one of 3 things. He will have attempted to sanitize berth 317 and the Meridian Transit Agency records. He will have attempted to contact George Aldbourne, or he will have attempted to contact someone above him, someone with the authority to suppress the story before publication." He paused. "Any of those 3 actions taken by a deputy assistant commissioner in connection with a criminal shipping operation constitutes evidence, and I have arranged for each of those 3 actions to be monitored by your Whitehall contact, among others." I looked at him. "Where did you go this morning?" "In the disguise. To a club in Pall Mall," he said, "of which Holt is a member. I had a conversation with a man who was having lunch there, a conversation that was, on the surface, about a matter entirely unrelated to our case, but which contained, embedded in it, 2 pieces of information calculated to reach Holt's ear through a channel he regards as reliable." He sat. "I told this man that a journalist at the Chronicle had been asking about the East Anglian coastal trade, specifically a company called the Meridian Transit Agency, and I told him that I had heard, through a connection I did not name, that Sherlock Holmes had been retained in connection with the death of a sailor, and was known to be making inquiries at Harwich. I considered this. You confirmed his fears through a source he trusts, and through us through the Chronicle's tips simultaneously. Pressure from 2 directions is more convincing than pressure from 1, Holmes said. And a man who receives the same alarming information from 2 unconnected sources tends to believe it without further verification. He will think the net is closing around Harwich. Yeah. And while he is looking at Harwich, we will be at Kensington." He rose. "Go and wash, Watson, and load your revolver. I think it very unlikely that we will need it this afternoon, but I prefer to have it present and unnecessary than absent and necessary." Number 7 Onslow Gardens, Kensington, was a handsome double-fronted house of the kind occupied by men of senior professional standing, not ostentatious, not modest, precisely calculated in its respectability, everything in its exterior saying that its owner was a man of consequence who had no need to prove it. The gardens were well kept. The ironwork was freshly painted. A polished brass plate beside the door bore the name R. V. Holt in the restrained typography of a man who considers it sufficient to state his name and trusts that the name carries its own authority. We arrived at 3:40. Holmes had hailed a cab 2 streets away, and we walked the last distance, which gave him the opportunity to conduct the rapid, comprehensive surveillance of the immediate vicinity that I had learned to recognize and not interrupt. He noted things I could not have catalogued and filed them in the architecture of his plan, with no external indication of what he saw or what weight he assigned it. Miss Elspeth Vane was waiting for us in the garden of the house directly opposite number 8, belonging to a family named Carlyle, who Holmes had established, currently in Bath for a fortnight, and whose housekeeper was an old acquaintance of Mrs. Hudson's, and had been prevailed upon, through that connection, to allow us the use of the front garden for an hour. She stood in the shadow of a large laurel with the composed, deliberate stillness of a woman who has been afraid for a long time and has resolved that the fear will not prevent her from being where she needs to be. She had the envelope under her arm. When she saw Holmes, something in her face released a fraction, the involuntary relaxation of a person who has been holding a great deal of weight in isolation and has, at last, others beside them under the load. "He is inside," Holmes said quietly. "His carriage arrived 20 minutes ago. My contact's communication was evidently sufficient to bring him home from his club. There is one manservant visible through the ground-floor window. No other staff in evidence." He looked at us both. "In approximately 7 minutes, Deputy Assistant Commissioner Holt will receive another visitor, a man from my contacts department, who carries a letter that Holt believes to be a private communication requiring his immediate response. It will occupy him for perhaps 5 minutes and require him to go to his study." "And while he is in his study," I said. "We will be in his drawing room," Holmes said. "Waiting for him." Miss Vane looked at him. "How do we get in?" Holmes produced from his coat pocket a key. He held it up briefly and returned it to his pocket. "The housekeeper's duplicate," he said. "Obtained this morning through channels I shall not detail." He looked at his watch. 3 minutes. "When I move, follow me directly and quietly. Watson behind me. Miss Vane behind Watson." We stood in silence for 3 minutes. The street was quiet in the February afternoon, a maid crossing with a basket, a boy with a newspaper, the distant sound of a horse on the far road. Ordinary London, ordinary Tuesday. Then Holmes moved. The drawing-room of R.V. Holt was exactly as I would have imagined it had I tried. A room of solid, expensive, masculine comfort. Dark wood, leather, good fire, shelves of legal and administrative texts arranged with institutional precision. A large desk in the corner, which I recognized immediately as the working surface of a man who conducted private business at home, not the desk of a reader or a correspondent, but the desk of someone who made decisions and kept records and did not trust those records to an office. We had perhaps 4 minutes before the visitor from Whitehall concluded his business and Holt came to find us. Holmes used them with characteristic economy. He went directly to the desk, opened the central drawer unlocked, which he appeared to have expected, and scanned its contents with a rapid, trained eye. He produced a small notebook from his coat and wrote something in it without pausing in his examination. Then he opened the left-hand drawer, and I heard from across the room a brief sharp intake of breath that, from Holmes, represented the controlled expression of something considerably more forceful. He looked up at me. He held up, briefly, a small bound ledger, the kind used for accounts. The cover was stamped with the words Meridian Transit. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He replaced the ledger, closed the drawer, and moved to the center of the room. He positioned himself with his back to the fire, in the stance of a man who has chosen his ground with care and intends to hold it. Miss Vane stood to his left, her envelope in her hands, her face pale but absolutely set. I took up a position to his right and was grateful, in a way I did not examine closely, for the weight of my revolver in my pocket. We heard the sound of a door. Footsteps in the hall, measured, unhurried, the footsteps of a man on his own ground. The drawing-room door opened. Rathbone Vickers. Holt was a man of perhaps 60, tall and broad-shouldered, with white hair worn short and a face that was, in its way, impressive, strong-featured, composed, the face of a man accustomed to authority and comfortable in it. He was well-dressed. He had the kind of presence that a room acknowledges involuntarily, the physical authority of a man who has spent decades being the senior person in every gathering he attended. He stopped when he saw us. The composure held for a full 2 seconds, a remarkable 2 seconds, during which nothing moved in his face but his eyes, which moved rapidly between the three of us with an assessment that was, even now, professional. Then his gaze reached Miss Vane, and the envelope under her arm, and something shifted, not breaking, not yet, but a fracture forming beneath the surface, visible only because Holmes and I were watching for it. "Mr. Holmes," he said. His voice was steady and cold as the February street outside. "You are in my house without invitation." "I am," Holmes said pleasantly. "I apologize for the informality. I felt that a formal appointment might give you time to make arrangements that would inconvenience us both." He tilted his head slightly. "I believe you know why we are here." Holt's gaze moved once more to the envelope in Elspeth Vane's hands. "I don't know who that young woman is," he said. "Yes," Holmes said very quietly. "You do!" The fire crackled. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the seconds with its patient, indifferent mechanism. Holt stood in the doorway of his own drawing-room, looking at the three of us, and I watched the composure, that impressive, long-maintained, professionally perfected composure begin, for the first time, to cost him something. "Whatever you think you have," he began. "I have the ledger in your left-hand desk drawer," Holmes said. "I have a fragment of your correspondence in Cornelius Vane's handwriting, preserved by his daughter, who is standing to my left. I have the testimony of a harbour-master's assistant in Harwich. I have the intelligence records of a department of Her Majesty's government, whose representative is currently waiting outside in the street. And I have," he paused, "a journalist from the Daily Chronicle who will be at berth 317 tomorrow morning." He said the last item in the list with perfect evenness, and I saw in Holt's eyes the precise moment at which the calculation completed itself, the moment at which a man of considerable intelligence arrives, against his will, at the conclusion he has been resisting. "Sit down, Commissioner," Holmes said. "We have a great deal to discuss." And Rathbone Vickers Holt, Deputy Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, sat down. There is a moment, in the resolution of every case I have recorded, which I have come to think of as the moment of architecture, the moment when Holmes, having held the full structure of his understanding in his own mind through the necessary days of concealment and misdirection, finally allows it to be seen. It is, every time, a different experience for the observer. Not simply the intellectual satisfaction of a puzzle completed, but something more complex, more human, the experience of watching a landscape reveal itself as the fog clears, the realization that what seemed like separate, disconnected features were always part of a single coherent terrain. That afternoon in Holt's Kensington drawing-room was, of all the moments of architecture I have witnessed, the one I find most difficult to set down, not because the logic was impenetrable, but because the weight of what had been done by the man sitting in that leather chair gave the elegance of Holmes's exposition a darkness I had not encountered in quite the same way before. One thing is to watch Holmes reconstruct the mechanism of a crime committed by a desperate man, or an angry man, or a greedy man. It is quite another to watch him reconstruct the mechanism of a crime constructed by a careful, intelligent, respectable man who had access to every instrument of justice, and used that access, deliberately and over years, as a shield for its exact opposite. Holmes did not sit. He stood before the fire, and he looked at Rathbone Vickers Holt with those clear, steady eyes, and he spoke, and the drawing-room was very quiet. "I shall begin," Holmes said, "with the compass, because it is the object that brought this matter to my attention, and because its full meaning was not, I confess, immediately apparent to me. A navigator's compass broken at the needle, left in the dead man's pocket. My first instinct was message that someone had used it to communicate something, either to a third party or simply as a gesture of contempt. But the message was not from the killer to anyone. It was from James Crewe to whoever came after him." Holt said nothing. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, still and deliberate as everything else about him. "Crewe went below decks on the return voyage from Gull Cove," Holmes continued. "He found what he found, the evidence of persons transported against their will, the physical reality of what the Hesperine was being used for. He knew from that moment that he was in danger. He was a young man of 24, alone on a vessel whose officers were complicit in what was happening, with no means of immediate communication with any authority he could trust. So he did what a navigator does when he cannot speak openly. He encoded what he knew. He crossed to the table where he had placed the broken compass at the beginning of the conversation, and held it up. He scratched 4 characters into the interior of his compass case, H317. Harwich, berth 317, the destination, the place where whatever the Hesperine carried would be delivered, and from which it would be dispersed. He had either overheard this, or deduced it from what he saw below. Or, I think this most likely had been told it accidentally by someone who did not realize he was listening. He encoded this information in the one object he was certain would not be searched, because a personal compass is not cargo, it is an instrument, a possession, the kind of thing a sailor keeps in his coat as naturally as a doctor keeps a watch. He set the compass down. He intended, when he came ashore, to use that information, to go to someone with it. He asked his father on Sunday evening whether silence made a man guilty. He was still weighing the question, still working out the full extent of what he had to do. And then someone on the Hesperine reported to Pardieu that Crewe had been below decks, and Pardieu reported to whoever he reported to, and by Sunday night the decision had been made. He looked at Holt. "You made that decision," he said, not accusingly, simply as a statement of fact, in the way one states that rain is wet or that fire is hot. "Pardieu informed you directly, not through Alborn, whose management role you had always kept at one remove from your own involvement, but directly. Because Crewe was a specific and immediate threat, and Alborn does not deal well with immediate threats. You do." Holt's eyes had not left Holmes throughout this account. They were still cold, still professional, still giving nothing away. But his hands, I noticed, had tightened by a fraction on the arms of the chair. "Pardieu was given his instruction," Holmes continued. "He carried it out that Sunday night, and then he broke the compass not to destroy it, but because breaking it was itself a message, a warning to anyone on the Hesperine who might have been considering following Crewe's example. A compass with a broken needle cannot show you true north. It was, in its way, an elegant choice, the kind of choice that comes not from a first mate's temperament, but from the mind of a man who thinks in symbols and appreciates their power." He paused. "Your mind, Commissioner." "This is conjecture," Holt said. It was the first thing he had said since sitting down, and he said it with the flat, professional authority of a man who has spent 30 years in the business of evaluating evidence. "A chain of inference without a single point of direct proof connecting me to the death of James Crewe." "Yes," Holmes said pleasantly. "Which is exactly why I did not stop at the death of James Crewe." He reached into his coat and produced Vane's letter and the fragment. He laid them on the low table between himself and Holt. "Cornelius, Vane spent the last months of his life building a case against you more carefully and more thoroughly than you gave him credit for, as I remarked when I first read his letter. He did not have everything. He had enough to know who the conductor was, and enough to know that going to the police was not an option, and enough to know that his life was in danger once he tried to act on what he knew." He looked at Holt steadily. "He died before he could finish what he had started. But he left what he had to his daughter, and his daughter brought it to me, and I have spent 3 days completing what Vane began." He listed them, one after another, in the unhurried manner of a man who has arranged his evidence carefully and is content to let it speak in sequence. "The meteorological records showing that the 9-day delay on the Hamburg run could not have been caused by weather, and that the Hesperine had therefore been somewhere she was not supposed to be. The testimony of Hannigan, dead now, but given to Holmes and to me and recorded in my notebook, which I produced and placed on the table beside Vane's letter. The harbour-master's assistant in Harwich, who had received payments from the Meridian Transit Agency, George Alborn's company, over 3 years, for the use of berth 317 during night hours, outside the normal harbour timetable. The intelligence records from Whitehall, which documented the divided circle, the Vrouw Mariek, and the operation at Gull Cove with a specificity that could only have been compiled from multiple sources over multiple voyages. And the ledger. Holmes turned to the desk and opened the left-hand drawer and brought it out again, the small, bound Meridian Transit ledger, and held it in both hands for a moment before setting it on the table. "This is the piece that I did not expect to find here," he said. "I expected the ledger to be at Alborn's offices or destroyed. Its presence in your desk speaks to something that I think is the most revealing thing about you, Commissioner, more revealing than the operation itself, more revealing than the deaths." He looked at Holt with an expression that was not contempt exactly, but its first cousin. "You kept it because you could not bear to be entirely dependent on Alborn. You kept a copy of the accounts because the accounts are the proof of what you are owed, your share, your leverage, your guarantee. You trusted your own safety, your own untouchability, so completely that you kept the one piece of evidence that no innocent man would have in his desk." Holt's jaw tightened. "That ledger could have been placed there?" "By whom?" Holmes said. "By me, between 3:40 and 3:45 this afternoon, with Dr. Watson and Miss Vane as witnesses to my every movement in this room." He shook his head. "You are a highly intelligent man, Commissioner. I suggest you do not advance arguments that you yourself would dismiss in 2 seconds as a professional matter. The fire, the clock, the weight of it all settling like sediment in still water." Elspeth Vane, who had not spoken since we entered the room, spoke now. Her voice was quiet and perfectly steady, and it had in it something that was not anger. Anger would have been understandable and expected, but something colder and more absolute. The voice of a person who has waited 8 months for this moment, and has decided precisely what they wish to say in it. "My father's name," she said, "was Cornelius Vane. He was 53 years old. He was a gentle, precise man who made one mistake in his life, which was trusting the wrong people, and who spent his last months trying to correct it." She looked at Holt. "He never got to finish, but you are going to answer for it. Not because Mr. Holmes has arranged it, or because the evidence is sufficient, though it is, but because there are also the people in the hold of the Hesperine, and the people before them, and the people you moved and sold and discarded over 4 years, and not one of them will have justice if you are permitted to sit in that chair and calculate your way out of this." She stopped. She had said what she came to say, and she did not say anything more. Holmes looked at Holt. The room was very still. "There is a man from Whitehall outside in the street," Holmes said. "Not a policeman, a man whose department operates with rather more latitude than the Metropolitan Police, and whose authority in matters of this kind supersedes it. He has been waiting for my signal." He reached into his pocket and produced a small brass whistle of the kind used by the river police, a detail that I found, even in that moment, characteristic. "When I use this, he will come in. You will go with him. The process after that is not my responsibility, but I am told it will be thorough." He paused. "I give you this moment to say whatever you wish to say, because in my experience, men who have held a secret for a long time sometimes find, at the moment of its ending, that they have something to say about it. I will not offer you the chance again." Holt was quiet for what felt like a very long time. I watched him, and I watched the thing that had always made him dangerous, that cold, precise, professional authority, go through some internal adjustment, some private reckoning whose details I could not see and did not need to see. He looked at Miss Vane for a moment, then at Holmes, then at his own hands, which were, for the first time since he had sat down, not entirely still. "The people in the hold," he said. His voice was different, not broken, not confessional, but something had gone out of it. "You make it sound broken, not confessional, but something had gone out of it. You make it sound simple. You make it sound as though they were—" He stopped. "Some of them were criminals. Some of them were people no government on the continent wanted, revolutionaries, anarchists, people the proper authorities of their own countries had very good reason to. Some of them," Holmes said quietly, "were none of those things. Some of them were ordinary people who had money and wanted to move and were taken instead of transported willingly. You know this because Vane's letter tells me that he confronted you with it, and you did not deny it to him. You told him that the distinction was not his to make." He let that sit for a moment. "I do not propose to argue the point with you. The law is considerably less interested in the distinction than you apparently are." Another silence. Then Holt said, with the final depleted precision of a man expending his last professional resource, "Whatever you have, whatever Whitehall thinks they can build from this, I will not make it simple for them." "I know," Holmes said. "Men in your position rarely do. It is the characteristic response of someone who has spent a career understanding how the machinery works, and believes that understanding confers the ability to stop it." He raised the whistle. "It does not." He blew it. The man from Whitehall, whose name I was not told, and have not since learned, was in the drawing-room within 90 seconds. Accompanied by 2 others whose bearing and economy of movement said what their plain clothes did not. They were professional and courteous and entirely unmovable, and they took Rathbone Vickers Holt out of his own drawing-room with the quiet, thorough efficiency of people who have done this kind of thing before and expect to continue doing it. Holt went without resistance. At the door he paused for a moment, not looking back at us, but pausing, in the way of a man marking a threshold, and then he went through it, and the door closed, and he was gone. Miss Vane sat down. It was the first time she had sat since we arrived, and the sitting was the involuntary sitting of a person from whom something heavy has been very suddenly removed, and who finds, without it, that her legs are less reliable than she had supposed. I moved to the chair beside her and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say, and I have learned over many years that the attempt to fill a silence of that particular quality with words is a form of interference rather than comfort. Holmes stood at the fire with his back to us for a short time. Then he turned, and he looked at the table where Vane's letter and the compass and the ledger lay, and he crossed to them and began to assemble them with the careful, methodical hands of a man completing a piece of work. He picked up the compass last. He held it in his palm and looked at it, at the broken needle, pointing nowhere, and I saw on his face, for a brief and private moment, the expression I had seen a handful of times in all our years together. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but a kind of deep, considered solemnity. The expression of a man who has looked at something terrible clearly and completely, and is marking in his own quiet way the looking. Then he closed his fingers around it and put it in his coat pocket. "Watson," he said, "I believe Miss Vane requires some tea, and I believe you and I both require something considerably stronger. There is a quiet hotel 2 streets from here where I know the proprietor. Shall we go?" Miss Vane looked up. Her dark eyes were dry. She was, I thought, beyond the stage of the case where tears were available, but there was in them something that had not been there when she walked into our Baker Street sitting-room 2 days ago. Not relief, not yet relief requires distance, and we were still too close to the events for that. But something like the first easing of a long-carried weight. The knowledge that the thing she had come to do was done. "Yes," she said, "I think I should like that very much." We went out into the February evening, the 3 of us, and the Kensington streets were quiet and cold and entirely ordinary, and the lamplighter was making his way along the far pavement with his long pole, bringing small circles of amber into the grey dusk, one after another, all the way down to the corner and beyond. I walked, and I thought of James Crew scratching 4 characters into the inside of a brass compass case in the dark of a ship's hold, with a certain knowledge that he was in danger, and the uncertain hope that the knowledge he was encoding would reach someone who could use it. It had. Slowly, imperfectly, at a cost that should not have been required, but it had. The lamps came on one by one, pushing the dark back by inches. Holmes looked at me over the rim of his coffee-cup with an expression that combined complete calm with the peculiar brightness which invariably preceded action. "You asked me yesterday whether I intended to tell you the entire plan, Watson." "I did." "I cannot. Not yet. I had expected as much. The habit does you credit." He folded the morning newspaper with almost mathematical precision and pushed aside the untouched kidneys upon his plate. "Everything that has occurred during the last 48 hours has produced precisely the effect I intended." "You speak," said I, "as though every movement of our opponents has been anticipated." "Not every movement." He smiled faintly. "But the important ones." Outside Baker Street the morning traffic had already begun to thicken. Milk carts rattled over the stones. A newspaper boy shouted the headlines of the latest edition. Somewhere a hansom cab splashed through the wet roadway left by the night's rain. London looked perfectly ordinary. That, I reflected afterward, was one of the strangest features of the affair. Entire criminal empires may exist behind perfectly respectable brick facades, while respectable gentlemen hurry past them carrying umbrellas. Holmes rose. "It is time. For Fleet Street?" "No." I looked up. "I thought you instructed me." "I instructed you to believe that was your task." He walked toward the fireplace. "If anyone has watched Baker Street since Dawn and I think it highly probable that they have your departure for Fleet Street will already have been anticipated. You deliberately allowed the false trail to exist, naturally. And the real destination?" Holmes reached into his dressing-gown pocket and withdrew a folded card. He handed it to me. One line was written upon it: 17 Ashcombe Terrace, Kensington. "What is there?" "A house." "I can see that." "A house," Holmes repeated, "which belongs through 2 intermediaries and a remarkably imaginative solicitor to a gentleman who officially possesses no connection whatever with it." "Holt." "Precisely." I looked again at the address. "The Deputy Assistant Commissioner keeps a secret residence?"
"He does."
"And you discovered this yesterday?" "I confirmed it yesterday." Holmes took his violin case from beside the chair. Not because he intended to play it, because hidden beneath the velvet lining lay a small collection of documents that no ordinary burglar would ever think to examine. "Watson," he said quietly, "today we cease collecting evidence." He paused. "Today we begin collecting men. There are occasions upon which Sherlock Holmes moved through London with such certainty that I could almost believe the streets themselves obeyed him. This was one. He chose no cab. Instead we walked, through Marylebone, across Oxford Street, into Kensington by a succession of quiet roads that avoided every obvious thoroughfare. Twice Holmes paused without explanation, once to examine the window of a bookseller, once to light his pipe. Neither action had anything whatever to do with books or tobacco. He was watching reflections, watching whether anyone watched us. Only after 20 minutes did he nod almost imperceptibly. "We are alone." "You are certain?" "As certain as a man can ever be." Ashcombe Terrace proved to be among the quietest streets in Kensington. Respectable, comfortable, precisely the kind of place where successful civil servants might maintain discreet private arrangements unknown even to their acquaintances. Number 17 differed from its neighbours in only one respect. Its curtains were drawn. Though the hour was not yet 11, Holmes stopped opposite the house. "What do you observe?" "No movement." "What else?" I looked harder. The brass knocker had recently been polished. The front steps had been scrubbed. Fresh carriage tracks marked the wet roadway. Holmes nodded. "Within the last hour." "And someone remains inside?" "I think several." His eyes travelled slowly across the upper windows. Then suddenly he smiled. "The game begins." He crossed the street openly, not stealthily. He rang the bell. A servant answered after nearly half a minute. "I wish to see Mr. Harrington." "There is no Mr. Harrington here." "I think there is." "You are mistaken." Holmes produced a visiting card. The servant glanced at it. Everything changed, not dramatically, merely the smallest tightening around his eyes. Holmes had obtained precisely what he wanted. The door closed. We waited. Within the house I heard rapid footsteps, more than one pair, voices, a door opening upstairs. Then silence. Holmes turned away before anyone returned. "We may go." "You are leaving?" "I have already achieved my purpose." "What purpose?" "I wish them to know that I know." Only when we had reached the next street did he explain. "The servant recognized neither my name nor the fictitious Mr. Harrington." "Then why recognize neither my name nor the fictitious Mr. Harrington?" "Then why present the card?" "Because the card bore something more interesting." He handed it to me. Upon its reverse was drawn in pencil the divided circle, the same symbol, the mark of the network. "They have seen it." "And?" Holmes's eyes glittered. "Now they must decide who sent it. They will suspect one another. They already do." For the first time I began to understand. Holmes was not merely hunting the organization. He was encouraging it to consume itself. We had scarcely reached Hyde Park when a boy of perhaps 12 approached. For Mr. Holmes, he handed over an envelope. No address, no seal. Holmes opened it while walking. Inside lay only one sentence. "You have become troublesome." Unsigned. Holmes laughed. Actually laughed. "I congratulate them." "On threatening your life?" "No." "Then on what?" "They have acknowledged the move." He folded the paper carefully. "A threat is an admission." "Of guilt?" "Of anxiety." That afternoon events moved with astonishing rapidity. By 4 o'clock Lestrade himself appeared in Baker Street. His usually confident expression had vanished. "Holmes." "What is it?" "We've lost him." "Pardieu." "No." "Holt?" Lestrade stared. "You knew?" "I suspected." "He resigned this afternoon." Holmes said nothing. "He walked out of Scotland Yard before luncheon." "And?" "No one knows where he went." Holmes leaned back quietly. "I do." Lestrade blinked. "You do?" "Yes." The Kensington house. For perhaps 10 seconds the inspector simply looked at him. Finally, "How in heaven's name?" Holmes merely smiled. "Would you care to accompany Dr. Watson and myself this evening, Lestrade?" "To arrest him?" "No." "Then why?" "To watch." "For what?" Holmes rose and looked toward the darkening London sky beyond Baker Street. "For the conductor." The room fell silent. Even Lestrade, who knew nothing of divided circles or hidden harbors or murdered directors, seemed to recognize that Holmes had spoken not of Holt, but of the invisible man standing above Holt. The man whom Cornelius Vane had feared, the man James Crewe had unknowingly discovered, the man who had remained unseen from the beginning. And as Holmes stood motionless before the window, I experienced once again that curious certainty which had never yet failed me in all our years together. The hunt was nearly over. The real quarry, at last, had begun to move. When I have attempted in later years to arrange the events of that remarkable investigation into some orderly sequence, I have always found myself returning to one particular evening. It was not because a shot was fired, nor because an arrest was made. Indeed, neither occurred. It remains fixed in my memory because I witnessed Sherlock Holmes place an entire criminal organization upon a chessboard of his own construction and compel its unseen master to make the first fatal mistake. The rain began shortly after 6 o'clock. Not a violent storm, but the steady grey drizzle so familiar to London, softening every outline until the city itself appeared wrapped in mourning. Holmes stood before the fire at Baker Street, his hands clasped behind his back. Lestrade occupied the chair nearest the window, though I doubt whether he had noticed the weather at all. His attention never strayed far from Holmes. "You still refuse to explain," he said at last. "I refuse," Holmes answered pleasantly, "only because explanation would diminish your usefulness." Lestrade frowned. "I've never known another man who could make an insult sound like a compliment. It is neither." Holmes reached for his violin. To my surprise he actually played, only for a minute. A slow, reflective passage that drifted through the sitting-room with extraordinary melancholy before ending as abruptly as it had begun. He laid the instrument aside. "My mind is clear." Lestrade stared. "You play before making arrests?" "I play," Holmes replied, "before making decisions." At precisely 6:30 there came 3 deliberate knocks upon the front door. Not hurried, not timid, measured. Mrs. Hudson admitted a gentleman whose appearance would have escaped notice in any London crowd. He wore the respectable black coat of a solicitor, grey gloves, a neatly trimmed beard. Nothing distinguished him except his eyes. They moved constantly, never resting. Holmes greeted him without surprise. "Good evening, Mr. Fenwick." The visitor inclined his head. "You expected me?" "I have expected you since yesterday." Lestrade glanced sharply between them. "You know this man?" "I know," said Holmes quietly, "that he has delivered messages for Deputy Assistant Commissioner Holt on no fewer than 9 occasions during the past year." The stranger's expression altered only slightly. "You are mistaken." "No." Holmes motioned toward the empty chair. "Please sit down." To my astonishment, for nearly a minute no one spoke. Holmes examined the visitor as though studying an unusual specimen beneath a microscope. Finally, "You have come because Holt has disappeared." Mr. Fenwick folded his gloves carefully. "I know nothing of Mr. Holt." Holmes smiled. "A poor beginning." "You also know," Holmes continued, "that the Kensington house is no longer safe." Still silence. "And you have been instructed to discover exactly how much I know." The man's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly. There it was again, that tiny involuntary movement upon which Holmes so often built entire conclusions. "You are remarkably observant. I make it my profession." The interview continued for nearly 20 minutes. Holmes asked questions that appeared entirely unrelated. About railway timetables, shipping ledgers, charitable trusts, insurance companies. Each inquiry seemed harmless, each answer equally insignificant. Yet I could see Holmes assembling them into some invisible structure. At length Mr. Fenwick rose. "I fear I can be of no assistance." "No," Holmes answered. "You already have?" The man hesitated. "What do you mean?" Holmes stepped toward the mantelpiece. "I mean that during this conversation you have confirmed 3 facts. He raised one finger. "Holt no longer commands the organization. The circle is divided into rival factions, and someone above Holt now fears betrayal more than police investigation." For the first time, the visitor lost control, only for an instant. His face became almost colorless. Then the mask returned. Without another word he bowed and departed. The front door closed. Lestrade sprang to his feet. "Why in God's name didn't we arrest him?" Holmes remained motionless. "Because he has committed no offense in this room." "But he's involved." "Undoubtedly. I have no interest in messengers." Holmes looked toward the fire. "I seek the man who writes the messages." Within an hour another development followed. A telegram arrived. Holmes opened it, read it once, then handed it to me. It contained only 4 words. "Holt requests safe passage." Lestrade almost shouted. "He wants to surrender." Holmes shook his head. "No." "What then?" "He wants protection." "From whom?" Holmes looked at us gravely. "The same man who murdered James Crewe." The implication struck us both at once. If Holt feared death, then someone even more powerful remained free. "We leave immediately," Holmes announced. "For Scotland Yard?" asked Lestrade. "For the river." "The river?" "The Thames has always been London's oldest road." He extinguished his pipe. "And tonight someone intends to travel upon it." Darkness had settled completely by the time we reached the embankment. The rain had ceased. Mist rolled across the black water like drifting smoke. Gas lamps shone only as blurred yellow circles. Perfect conditions for secrecy. Holmes stopped beneath an archway overlooking the docks. "We wait." "For Holt?" "No." "For whoever comes to kill him." Minutes passed. A solitary launch emerged from the mist. No lights, no sound beyond the slow beat of its engine. Another answered from farther downstream. Lestrade whispered, "There are 2." Holmes nodded. "Exactly as I expected." The launches drew nearer until they lay scarcely 50 yards apart. A lantern flashed once, twice, then darkness again. "A signal," I murmured. "What does it mean?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he suddenly stiffened. There! A shadow separated itself from the stern of the nearer launch. Another man, tall, broad-shouldered. He stepped ashore with remarkable confidence. Even from that distance something about him suggested authority. Not wealth, not rank. Men instinctively moved aside as he passed. Holmes drew a slow breath. At last. "You know him?" "No, but I know what he is. The conductor." Holmes's voice was scarcely above a whisper. "The only man capable of directing every movement without ever appearing in the score." The stranger disappeared into an abandoned warehouse beside the river. Holmes turned instantly. We crossed the deserted wharf at a run. The warehouse door hung slightly open. Dust floated through thin shafts of moonlight piercing the broken roof. Crates stood in uneven rows. No sign of the stranger. No footsteps. Nothing. Lestrade drew his revolver. "He's gone." Holmes slowly surveyed the vast interior. "No." He pointed toward the center of the floor. There, etched into the dust by a walking cane, was a single symbol, a circle, divided cleanly in half, very fresh. Beneath it lay a folded sheet of paper. Holmes unfolded it carefully. There were only 2 lines written in a precise, elegant hand. "You have followed the music admirably, Mr. Holmes, but conductors are rarely seen by the audience." For the first time since this investigation had begun, I saw Sherlock Holmes smile with genuine admiration. "He has accepted the challenge." Lestrade looked bewildered. "What challenge?" Holmes folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. "The final one." He turned toward the warehouse entrance, where the mist once again swallowed the river beyond. "Our adversary has ceased hiding." His eyes shone with that fierce light I had witnessed before only in the gravest of cases. "He has invited us to find him." And in that lonely warehouse upon the Thames, surrounded by silence and the fading echo of an unseen enemy's footsteps, I realized that every mystery from the altered portrait to the death of James Crewe, from Cornelius Vane's confession to Holt's betrayal, had merely been the opening movements of a far greater game. The end at last had begun. There are moments in every great investigation when the accumulated weight of scattered facts suddenly falls into perfect alignment, like the final pieces of an intricate puzzle finding their appointed places. Such a moment came to Sherlock Holmes upon the morning following our strange adventure in the abandoned warehouse beside the Thames. To me, the note left by our invisible adversary appeared little more than an act of calculated insolence. To Holmes, it was a confession. He remained awake throughout the night. When I descended shortly after 7 o'clock, I found him seated amid an astonishing collection of papers. Maps of London covered the carpet. Shipping manifests lay open across the dining table. Railway schedules, property deeds, newspaper cuttings, and copies of police reports formed ordered piles upon every available surface. The chemical corner had not escaped. Upon one burner rested the remains of an experiment involving several varieties of ink. Holmes himself looked surprisingly refreshed. "You have slept?" I asked. "Not at all." "You appear remarkably cheerful." "I generally am," he answered, "when my opponent commits an error." "The note?" "Precisely." I picked it up once more. "You have followed the music admirably, Mr. Holmes, but conductors are rarely seen by the audience." "I confess," said I, "that I still fail to perceive the mistake." Holmes accepted the paper and held it toward the window. "The handwriting is disguised." "So I imagined." "The language is not." He reached for one of the notebooks lying nearest his elbow. "Observe." Upon one page appeared extracts copied from numerous letters recovered during the investigation. Cornelius Vane's correspondence. Commercial memoranda. Anonymous warnings. Legal notices. Each sentence had been carefully compared. Each sentence had been carefully compared. "The same man," Holmes continued, "may alter his handwriting, but he seldom alters the architecture of his thought. I do not understand. He invariably prefers musical metaphors." Holmes pointed to several phrases. "The first movement, a false note, the final performance. Audience!" He looked at me with quiet satisfaction. "Our unknown friend thinks in music." By noon Holmes had reached a conclusion, not merely regarding the mysterious conductor, but regarding his identity. He closed the final notebook. "It is extraordinarily simple, as most of your explanations become after the event." Holmes laughed softly. "My dear Watson, simplicity is merely complexity properly understood." "Then who is he?" Holmes shook his head. I shall tell you only after we have placed him under arrest. At 1:30 Inspector Lestrade arrived in considerable excitement. Holt has been found. Alive? Barely. Where? A warehouse in Wapping. Lestrade removed his hat. He was bound to a chair. Injured? No. Worse. What could be worse? He'd been left alive. Holmes nodded slowly. As I expected. Lestrade looked astonished. You expected mercy? No. I expected theatre. We accompanied Lestrade immediately. The warehouse proved to be deserted save for Holt himself. The former deputy assistant commissioner appeared 20 years older than when I had last seen him. His immaculate confidence had vanished. His hands trembled violently. The instant Holmes entered, Holt struggled to his feet. You must protect me. Holmes remained perfectly still. From whom? You know... I know many things. His voice faltered. No. He swallowed painfully. Not the circle. For several moments no one spoke. Finally Holmes said quietly, You have never before spoken of a single superior. Holt buried his face in his hands, because there was never meant to be proof that he existed. The confession that followed occupied nearly an hour. Piece by piece the hidden structure emerged. The divided circle had never truly been a society. It was a mechanism. Its members knew only those immediately above and below them. Messages traveled through trusted intermediaries. Orders arrived unsigned. Money appeared without explanation. Failure was punished. Success was rewarded. And at the summit, one unseen intelligence. The conductor, Holmes murmured. Holt nodded. We never knew his name. You met him. Only twice. What did you observe? Holt closed his eyes. He never repeated a disguise. He altered his voice. Always. He carried no papers. No. He trusted no one. No. Holmes asked one final question. What frightened him? For the first time Holt answered without hesitation. Holmes smiled. There, Watson. You have it? I have had it since breakfast. We returned to Baker Street shortly before dusk. Holmes immediately packed his revolver, magnifying lens, violin case, and a small sealed envelope. I noticed the address. It read simply, To be opened only if Sherlock Holmes does not return. You anticipate danger. I anticipate possibilities. He handed the envelope to me. If anything should happen tonight, I refuse to accept it. You will? Reluctantly. I did. At 8 o'clock precisely a closed carriage drew up before Baker Street. Inside sat only one passenger, Mr. Fenwick, the solicitor. He removed his hat. My employer requests the honor of your company. Holmes smiled. At last. Lestrade stepped forward. We'll arrest him now. Holmes shook his head. No. Why? Because we have not yet reached the stage upon which the final act is to be performed. He entered the carriage, then looked back at me. Watson. Yes? I believe this journey concludes the affair. I climbed in beside him. Lestrade followed. The carriage rolled silently into the London night. For nearly 40 minutes we travelled through unfamiliar streets until at last the horses slowed before a great Victorian mansion hidden behind iron gates and ancient elm trees. No lights shone from the upper windows. The house stood in complete darkness. Fenwick opened the carriage door. My employer awaits. Holmes stepped onto the gravel. He studied the silent mansion for several seconds. Then, with the faintest smile, he said, I have spent 3 weeks searching for a ghost. He turned to me. It appears, Watson, that the ghost has finally invited us home. Together we crossed the threshold. The massive oak doors closed behind us with a deep, echoing boom that reverberated through the empty hall. Somewhere within the darkness, a single slow clap echoed. Twice. Then a calm, cultured voice emerged from the shadows. Miss Holmes. A pause. I have been looking forward to this meeting. Holmes removed his gloves with deliberate composure. So have I. And as the unseen figure stepped into the faint glow of a solitary lamp, I found myself face to face with the man whose invisible hand had guided every crime, every deception, and every death from the very beginning. The conductor had finally revealed himself. It has often been my experience that the greatest criminals possess neither the savage appearance nor the theatrical manner imagined by the public. Indeed, the most dangerous man I have ever encountered outside the infamous Professor Moriarty entered that lonely drawing-room with the quiet courtesy of a university scholar. He was of middle height. His hair, touched with silver, was brushed with meticulous care. His evening dress was faultless. His face, though handsome, possessed that peculiar absence of expression which one observes in men who have long disciplined every emotion into submission. Only his eyes betrayed him. Intelligent beyond ordinary measure, they rested upon Sherlock Holmes with unmistakable admiration. "So," said the stranger, "we meet at last." Holmes inclined his head. "I believe so. You know my name?" "No." "But I know your profession." The gentleman smiled. "An unusual answer. You are not merely a criminal." "No? You are an organizer." He smiled more broadly. "And what distinguishes one from the other?" "The criminal commits offenses." Holmes removed his gloves. "The organizer persuades respectable men to commit them for him." For the first time the stranger laughed, a quiet, genuine laugh. "Mr. Holmes, I begin to understand why even Holt feared you." He motioned toward a table already prepared for supper. "Will you dine?" "No. A pity. I never eat while solving a case. Then perhaps we shall settle for conversation." Holmes took the chair opposite him. Lestrade remained near the door, one hand resting upon his revolver. I stood behind Holmes. The stranger regarded us all with complete composure. "You have called me the conductor," he said. "A convenient title. It appears appropriate. I never chose it." "No," Holmes replied. "It was chosen by your followers." The man's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You continue to impress me. You wish to know why I created the circle. I already know why." "Oh." "You believe society inefficient." The stranger remained. "Oh." "You believe society inefficient." The stranger remained silent. "You discovered," Holmes continued, "that judges may be bribed." He raised one finger. "Members of Parliament may be influenced." A second. "Police officers may be corrupted." A third. "Bankers may be intimidated." Finally, "You merely connected them." For several seconds there was absolute silence. Then the stranger slowly applauded. "Remarkable!" He leaned forward. "You know everything." "No." Holmes answered quietly. "I know enough." "I should like," said Holmes, "to hear one point explained. The portrait." At that word the stranger's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "The portrait," Holmes repeated, "from which this investigation began. A curious place to begin. It is the proper place." The stranger folded his hands. "It was never intended to become important." "No?" "It served only as a signal." "A signal to whom?" "To every senior member of the circle." He smiled faintly. "When the portrait changed at midnight, they knew the organization had entered its final phase." I felt a sudden chill. "The painting was merely a code?" "Exactly." Holmes nodded slowly. "I believed as much." The altered face represented betrayal. The clock represented the appointed hour. The hidden pigments ensured that only those who knew where to look would understand. He looked toward Holmes. "Unfortunately, James Crewe understood. So Crewe had to die." The stranger's voice became almost regretful. "And Cornelius Vane?" "He became frightened." "Holt?" "He became ambitious." The stranger shrugged. "I have dismissed both kinds of men throughout my career." Holmes rose. "I believe our conversation has reached its conclusion." "You think you have won." "I know I have." The stranger smiled once more. "I wonder." He reached calmly into the breast pocket of his coat. Lestrade instantly drew his revolver. "Don't move!" The gentleman ignored him. He produced a small silver watch. Nothing more. He opened it. Inside lay a tiny photograph. A young woman, perhaps 20 years of age. "My daughter." He closed the watch gently. "She died 10 years ago." Holmes remained silent. "I spent 20 years believing the law would punish those responsible. It never did. The guilty purchased witnesses. They purchased judges. They purchased newspapers. They purchased freedom." His voice remained perfectly calm. "So I built something stronger. I became the law they escaped." For the first time that evening I perceived the terrible tragedy beneath the man's crimes. He had not begun as a monster. He had become one. Holmes seemed to read my thoughts. "Personal grief," he said quietly, "explains conduct. It never excuses it." The stranger met Holmes's gaze. "I expected you to say precisely that." A clock somewhere within the mansion struck 11. The stranger sighed. "Our time is finished." "I agree." Holmes gave the slightest nod. The front doors burst open. Heavy footsteps thundered through the entrance hall. Within seconds armed officers flooded the room from every direction. Lestrade smiled grimly. "I thought we'd never get the signal." The stranger looked around without surprise. "You anticipated my invitation." Holmes nodded. "The moment Fenwick arrived, you allowed yourself to be brought here." "Certainly." "You knew this house was surrounded." "From the beginning." The stranger laughed softly. "Magnificent!" Without resistance he extended his wrist. Lestrade fastened the handcuffs. "I arrest you for the murders of James Crewe, Cornelius Vane, Alfred Pardew, and numerous other offences against the Crown." The prisoner merely bowed. As he was led toward the door, he paused beside Holmes. "There is one difference between us." "What is that?" "You believe justice belongs to the law." "And you?" "I believe the law belonged to justice." Holmes answered without hesitation. When men decide that they alone are justice, they inevitably become criminals. For the first time, the prisoner's confidence faltered. Only for a heartbeat. Then he disappeared into the London night under heavy guard. 3 weeks later, the newspapers celebrated the destruction of the mysterious criminal network known unofficially as the Divided Circle. Dozens of arrests followed. Hidden accounts were seized. Corrupt officials resigned. Secret correspondence filled the evidence rooms of Scotland Yard. Yet the public never learned the whole truth, nor did Holmes desire it. "There is no advantage," he remarked one evening, "in teaching ambitious men how closely they once came to success." The altered portrait was quietly returned to its rightful owners. Its concealed pigments were removed forever. No face would again change at midnight. As for Sherlock Holmes, he accepted neither honors nor public praise. When I congratulated him upon bringing down one of the most elaborate criminal organizations in modern England, he merely reached for his violin. "My dear Watson," he said with a smile, "the game is never truly finished." He drew the bow across the strings. A gentle melody filled the sitting-room of Baker Street. Outside, London continued its endless movement beneath the evening fog, unaware that another shadow had vanished from its streets. And as I watched my extraordinary friend lose himself in music once more, I reflected that while evil might alter its disguises from age to age, there would always remain one man capable of seeing through them. That man was Sherlock Holmes.